My wife and I once owned a modest beach house, but we eventually relocated to the city. I had not visited that property for 20 years while she quietly went there 4 times a year. When she passed away, my children immediately told me to sell that useless place. I decided to visit the property one last time before selling it. When I opened the rusty gate, I froze at what was actually living there. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who severely underestimated your true worth. My name is Warwick. I am 69 years old and I recently buried my beautiful wife, Gwendolyn. The repast was happening right inside our city home. The house hummed with the loud chatter of guests eating the expensive food we provided. I retreated to the kitchen to find a moment of peace. Connor followed me. He is my white son-in-law and a man who measures every human interaction in dollars. He cornered me against the marble counter and slammed a thick real estate contract right next to the coffee maker. He loudly complained about the exorbitant catering costs he had supposedly fronted for the funeral. He pointed a demanding finger at my chest and ordered me to sign the beach house over to him immediately to recoup those ridiculous expenses. He claimed the property was a financial drain and a heavy burden I could no longer manage alone. He wanted my signature before Gwendolyn was even cold in the ground. The sheer audacity of his hostile demand hung heavily in the air of my own kitchen on this very solemn and deeply painful day. Ebony pushed through the swinging kitchen doors and immediately stood shoulder to shoulder with her arrogant husband. She did not ask how I was coping with the loss of her mother. Instead, she completely sided with Connor and launched into a brutal tirade against my intelligence. She practically spat her words at me while adjusting her expensive designer dress. She directly insulted the beach house and called it a worthless pile of rotting wood that was only dragging their future inheritance down into the mud. She coldly told me that I was entirely too old and feeble to manage any kind of real estate property anymore. She demanded I stop acting like a stubborn old fool and sign the document Connor had prepared. I turned my head away from her toxic glare and looked directly at Derek, hoping for some kind of filial defense. My own flesh and blood stood leaning against the refrigerator frame just a few feet away. Derek completely avoided making any eye contact with me whatsoever. He just stared intensely at the polished hardwood floor and nervously sipped his strong alcoholic drink in absolute cowardly silence. He allowed his sister and his brother-in-law to verbally abuse his grieving father without raising a single finger to stop them. Their collective disrespect was an orchestrated physical assault on my dignity. They viewed my tragic loss purely as a lucrative financial opportunity for themselves. The betrayal stung worse than the actual grief of burying my beloved wife. I realized instantly that the loving family I thought I had cultivated over the past 4 decades was an absolute illusion created by my own blind paternal devotion. I stood completely alone, surrounded by greedy strangers wearing the familiar faces of my own children in this dark kitchen space. I did not argue with them or show any visible signs of my profound internal grief. Screaming would only grant them the emotional validation they desperately craved. I kept my face entirely impassive and maintained absolute silence while they finished their venomous speeches. I slowly reached out and picked up the real estate contract from the marble counter. I calmly folded the document in half and slid it directly into my inner suit jacket pocket. I then looked Connor squarely in his arrogant blue eyes and firmly demanded he step away from the doorway immediately. Connor let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed terribly against the kitchen tiles. He boldly stepped closer to me instead of moving aside. He sneered at my stubbornness and called me a pathetic old man holding on to useless dirt. He aggressively threatened to hire aggressive lawyers to take over the entire estate legally if I became a persistent burden to the family. He promised he could easily convince a corrupt family court judge that I was mentally unfit to handle my own financial affairs due to extreme bereavement. He stated clearly that he would drain every single penny I possessed through endless legal battles unless I voluntarily signed the paper by morning. His menacing tone completely stripped away any lingering facade of familial respect. He was actively declaring a vicious psychological war against a grieving widower. I memorized every single threat he issued while standing inside the house my wife and I had built together. I recognized that my peaceful retirement had abruptly ended and a new brutal fight for survival had officially begun. I refused to let these vicious parasites consume the legacy Gwendolyn and I had secured over a long lifetime of hard and honest labor in this cold, dark city. I shoved past Connor with forceful determination and walked straight out the back door of my own house. I abandoned the crowded repast and completely ignored the shocked murmurs of the ungrateful guests sitting in my living room. I grabbed my car keys from the hook and locked myself inside my reliable vehicle. I gripped the steering wheel tightly until my knuckles turned white and then started the powerful engine. I drove away from the bustling city under the heavy cover of a moonless night. I needed to see that dilapidated coastal property one final time before the greedy vultures successfully managed to strip it away from my rightful possession. The desolate highway stretched out endlessly before me like a dark ribbon of asphalt cutting through the silent landscape. I pushed the gas pedal down hard while my mind raced through decades of beautiful memories mixed with current betrayals. The coastal wind began to fiercely whip against my windshield as I neared the distant ocean boundary. I expected to find a collapsed wooden shack surrounded by overgrown weeds and shattered glass. I anticipated seeing a miserable piece of rotting architecture waiting desperately for a bulldozer to finally put it out of its structural misery. The familial conflict burning inside my heart was suddenly overshadowed by a profound sense of bizarre anticipation. The winding dirt road eventually transitioned into freshly paved concrete, which immediately confused my tired senses. I turned the final sharp corner and slammed hard on my brakes. The headlights of my car cut through the dense midnight fog, illuminating a scene that completely shattered my preconceived expectations. I slowly stepped out of the vehicle and stared in absolute disbelief at the colossal mystery towering directly in front of my very eyes on this dark and chilly night. The coastal wind howled against the windshield of my vehicle as I navigated the winding dirt road toward the property I had not seen in 20 years. I fully expected to find a collapsed wooden shack drowning in overgrown weeds and shattered glass. I anticipated a miserable piece of rotting architecture waiting desperately for a bulldozer to finally put it out of its structural misery. The familial conflict burning inside my heart was suddenly overshadowed by a profound sense of bizarre anticipation. The winding dirt path eventually transitioned into freshly paved concrete, which immediately confused my tired senses. I turned the final sharp corner and slammed hard on my brakes. The headlights of my vehicle cut through the dense midnight fog, illuminating a scene that completely shattered my preconceived expectations. I slowly stepped out of the vehicle and stared in absolute disbelief at the colossal mystery towering directly in front of my very eyes on this dark and chilly night. The old rusty gate I remembered was completely gone. In its place stood a towering, reinforced steel barricade flanking a massive state-of-the-art technological incubator. High concrete walls completely surrounded the perimeter, topped with advanced security cameras tracking my every movement. Pristine landscaping replaced the dirt yard of my memories, featuring manicured hedges and softly glowing pathway lights. The sheer scale of the modern facility was breathtaking, a sprawling architectural marvel hidden away from the world. I walked closer to the glowing entrance, trying to reconcile the memory of our modest beach house with this fortress. My mind raced to understand how a structure of this magnitude could exist on my land without my knowledge. The shock paralyzed me as I stood frozen under the bright security floodlights, searching for answers in the heavy midnight ocean breeze now. 2 armed security guards immediately intercepted me before I could even touch the fortified steel entrance. They demanded my identification with professional aggression while blocking my path forward. I raised my hand slowly and calmly, stated that I was the legal owner of this entire property. A sharp young African-American man dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit quickly stepped out from the brightly lit glass lobby. He raised a hand to instantly halt the guards and studied my face with intense calculation. His sharp eyes immediately darted down to the gold wedding band resting heavily on my left hand. He commanded the guards to stand down and formally introduced himself as DeAndre, the facility manager. He respectfully addressed me by my full name and revealed that he had been expecting my eventual arrival. DeAndre guided me through the heavy glass doors into a breathtaking reception area filled with advanced technological equipment. He explained that my late wife Gwendolyn had masterminded this entire operation entirely behind my back. She had secretly transformed the decaying beach property into a multi-million-dollar technology academy specifically designed for underprivileged black youth. For 15 long years, she had quietly diverted funds from her private investments to build this magnificent sanctuary. She operated the facility through a complex web of anonymous corporate trusts to ensure her greedy son-in-law could never discover its existence. I listened to DeAndre speak while admiring the stunning architectural details surrounding me in the lobby. The sheer magnitude of Gwendolyn's deception was not a betrayal, but a profound act of familial preservation. She knew our family was deeply infected by greed, and she took drastic measures to protect our true legacy. The revelation completely altered my understanding of the woman I loved with all my heart and soul. DeAndre led me directly into an expansive administrative office and securely locked the heavy door behind us. He walked over to a steel safe and extracted a massive financial ledger bound in black leather. He placed the heavy document squarely onto the polished mahogany desk and slid it toward my hands. Gwendolyn had specifically instructed him to hand over these confidential records to me upon her passing. I opened the thick ledger and slowly began reading the meticulously detailed columns of numbers illuminating the pages. I discovered that Gwendolyn had not only built a thriving educational sanctuary, but had also generated staggering monthly profit margins through lucrative corporate sponsorships and aggressive technological patents. My beautiful wife was a brilliant silent visionary who had accurately diagnosed the dangerous financial rot festering deeply inside our own family unit. She knew that Connor would eventually bankrupt my daughter Ebony and attempt to seize our remaining assets to cover his disastrous business failures. She deliberately created this hidden corporate fortress to forever protect our generational wealth from his greedy, destructive hands. The sheer genius of her strategic planning overwhelmed my grieving heart with a profound sense of awe and boundless respect. She had quietly played a magnificent game of chess while Connor childishly manipulated my weak son Derek and my foolish daughter. Every single dollar accounted for in the ledger was a powerful weapon forged specifically to destroy any future attempts at familial extortion. I ran my fingers over her elegant signature located on the final page of the document. Gwendolyn had armed me perfectly for the brutal war she knew would inevitably come to our doorstep. I closed the ledger firmly and looked up at DeAndre, ready to assume my rightful position as the absolute master of this incredible secret empire starting today. DeAndre shattered my brief moment of awe by delivering a devastating piece of urgent information. He leaned across the desk and stated that our formidable security system had repelled a hostile intrusion exactly 3 days ago. Someone had aggressively attempted to force an illegal commercial appraisal of the property using a blatantly forged title deed. DeAndre immediately grabbed a small remote and turned on a large digital monitor mounted on the office wall. He accessed the archived security footage from the main perimeter cameras and pressed play. The high-definition video clearly displayed a sleek silver sports car aggressively parked directly outside the imposing and heavily fortified steel gates. A tall, angry man stepped out of the vehicle and violently argued with the automated intercom system, while aggressively waving a thick stack of fraudulent legal papers in the night air. I instantly recognized the sharp features and arrogant posture of my son-in-law Connor. He was literally attempting to steal the property and orchestrate an illegal corporate sale while my wife was drawing her final breaths in the hospital. The profound shock I felt quickly morphed into a terrifying surge of cold and calculated rage. Connor was not merely a disrespectful opportunist waiting for an inheritance to fall into his lap. He was an active criminal predator executing a sophisticated scheme of massive corporate theft against my family. DeAndre paused the video right on Connor's furious face and asked me what our next move should be. I stared at the frozen image of the man who had verbally abused me in my own kitchen just hours earlier. The familial conflict had instantly escalated into a high-stakes war for absolute survival. I firmly grabbed the heavy ledger and commanded DeAndre to permanently lock the steel gates behind me immediately. I drove back to my city residence with a fierce determination burning in my chest. The sprawling highways offered a fleeting moment of reflection before I faced the grim reality awaiting my return. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the chaotic hum of funeral guests had completely vanished. The caterers had cleared the tables, and the mourners had returned to their own insulated lives. The profound silence enveloping the property felt distinctly unnatural rather than peaceful. I bypassed the immaculate living room and marched directly toward the basement staircase. My heavy footsteps echoed loudly against the hardwood floor as I descended into the shadows. My private office had always served as a quiet sanctuary where Gwendolyn and I managed our lives far away from the judgmental eyes of our ungrateful children. I reached the bottom step and felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The heavy oak door protecting my office was violently splintered near the brass lock. Jagged wooden shards littered the pristine carpet, I pushed the ruined door open and stepped into a scene of absolute devastation. The room had been thoroughly ransacked by someone searching for specific financial leverage. Books were swept off the mahogany shelves and framed photographs of my late wife lay shattered across the floor. My eyes immediately darted toward the corner where I kept my secure steel filing cabinet. The reinforced lock had been brutally drilled open with a heavy industrial tool. Metal shavings sparkled under the harsh fluorescent overhead light. The intruders had bypassed the sentimental items and focused entirely on the locked drawers containing decades of confidential property records. I stood amidst the calculated wreckage and understood perfectly that the quiet disrespect shown at the repast had rapidly escalated into a highly orchestrated domestic invasion of my home. I stepped carefully over the debris to examine the violated cabinet drawers. I systematically checked the indexed folders containing our most sensitive estate documents. The life insurance policies were untouched, and the primary residence papers remained exactly where I left them. However, one specific folder had been entirely gutted. The original outdated deed to the beach house was gone. That particular piece of paper was drafted decades ago and legally described the property as nothing more than a barren plot of coastal dirt. Connor had brazenly stolen it during the funeral repast while pretending to mourn my wife in the kitchen. He deliberately used the chaotic gathering of grieving friends as a convenient cover to execute his corporate robbery. My eyes scanned the floor to piece together the timeline of their cowardly crime. Scattered tax documents lay trampled near the base of the broken cabinet. I knelt down and noticed a very distinct mark stamped aggressively onto a white manila envelope. It was a clear, muddy footprint matching the exact size and narrow heel of an expensive designer shoe. I recognized the specific tread pattern immediately. Ebony had worn those exact shoes during the burial service earlier this morning. My own daughter had physically stood in my basement and actively participated in the desecration of our family sanctuary. She had maliciously trampled over the memory of her mother to help her white husband steal what they believed was a vulnerable piece of coastal land. A cold wave of absolute clarity washed over me in that dark room. I no longer viewed them as my misguided children or frustrated relatives. They were dangerous criminals actively plotting my financial ruin. I stood up slowly and firmly formulated my exact response to their unforgivable domestic treachery and profound moral failure with steel determination tonight. I immediately pulled my cellular phone from my pocket and dialed my trusted legal counsel. Evelyn answered the call before the second ring finished sounding. I completely bypassed all the standard professional pleasantries and polite greetings we usually exchanged. I ordered her to initiate a comprehensive audit of my personal credit history and all property holdings under my name instantly. Evelyn recognized the severe urgency hardening my voice and asked me exactly what had occurred. I explained that my basement office door had been violently kicked open and my steel cabinet was destroyed. I detailed the specific theft of the outdated coastal deed showing the barren plot. I informed her that my son-in-law Connor and my daughter Ebony were the direct perpetrators of this severe invasion. Evelyn gasped quietly and immediately suggested we bring federal law enforcement into the situation. I explicitly ordered her to keep the police completely out of this matter for the time being. Calling the authorities now would only tip my hand prematurely and allow Connor to manipulate his way out of the consequences. I needed to trap him entirely inside his own arrogant scheme before dropping the final devastating legal hammer. Evelyn agreed to my strict terms without offering any further argument. She promised to utilize her extensive network of financial investigators to trace every single transaction connected to my stolen property deed. I instructed her to track down any newly forged signatures bearing my name. I ended the call and stood silently in my ruined office. I refused to clean up the terrible mess scattered across the floor. I wanted to remember exactly how deeply they had violated my home. I paced the room waiting patiently for Evelyn to uncover the full extent of this highly destructive corporate crime against my family. Exactly 30 minutes later, my cellular phone vibrated intensely against the mahogany desk. I answered instantly, and Evelyn delivered absolutely horrifying news that changed everything. She successfully bypassed standard banking protocols to access the dark financial networks operating beneath the city. Connor had aggressively weaponized the stolen, outdated deed representing the empty beach plot. He used that worthless piece of paper to officially secure a massive short-term commercial loan. He completely avoided legitimate banking institutions and instead finalized the agreement with a highly violent shadow syndicate. This ruthless criminal organization specialized in executing predatory loans featuring predatory interest rates and catastrophic personal consequences for any delayed payments. The disastrous loan was already fully executed, and the massive funds were completely transferred into his failing company accounts. My blood turned completely to ice as I processed the terrifying scale of his sheer stupidity. He had willingly invited dangerous criminals directly into our lives just to cover his massive financial blunders. Evelyn paused, taking a very deep breath before delivering the final devastating twist to this nightmare. She revealed that Connor could never have secured that enormous loan solely on his own ruined credit. He desperately needed a legally clean individual to officially act as his primary financial guarantor on the dangerous contract. My hands began to shake as Evelyn read the guarantor name aloud over the secure line. My foolish son Derek had blindly co-signed the illegal syndicate loan for his manipulative brother-in-law. Derek had essentially tied his own house and his very life to that inevitable criminal default. The familial conflict escalated from a simple property dispute into an imminent fight for the physical survival of my son. I thanked Evelyn and hung up, determined to brutally confront my weak son today before they destroyed him. I summoned Derek to a dilapidated roadside diner situated on the desolate industrial edge of the city. The establishment was entirely empty except for a single exhausted waitress wiping down the far counter. The flickering neon sign buzzed ominously against the rain-streaked window pane. I sat perfectly still in a cracked vinyl booth and waited for my only son to arrive. He pushed through the glass doors 10 minutes late, looking utterly exhausted and highly defensive. He wore a wrinkled business suit and carried the unmistakable stench of cheap alcohol and profound anxiety. He slid into the booth across from me and immediately began fabricating elaborate excuses regarding his busy schedule and heavy traffic. I did not raise my voice or offer any paternal lectures about his blatant disrespect. I did not express any disappointment regarding his cowardly behavior at the funeral repast. I simply reached into my tailored jacket and produced the devastating financial dossier Evelyn had secured for me. I placed the crisp copy of the illegal syndicate loan directly onto the sticky laminate table. I slowly pushed the damning document across the dividing space until it touched his trembling fingers. I watched his arrogant demeanor evaporate the exact second his eyes registered the criminal syndicate's highly recognizable corporate logo stamped at the top. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty ash. His chest heaved erratically as his breathing instantly escalated into a full-blown panic attack. He stared at the forged signatures and the horrific interest rates burning a hole through the paper. His hands began to shake uncontrollably, causing the laminated menu next to him to violently rattle against the table. The suffocating silence between us stretched out like a taut wire ready to finally snap into two pieces. Derek finally broke under the crushing weight of the undeniable evidence and confessed absolutely everything. He wildly rubbed his sweating forehead and admitted his deeply pathetic involvement in this massive corporate theft. Connor had aggressively manipulated him by repeatedly insisting the beach property was nothing more than useless dirt waiting to be seized by unpaid municipal taxes. Connor falsely promised that leveraging the abandoned land for a quick cash injection was the only possible way to save his rapidly failing construction firm from total bankruptcy. Derek believed the smooth lies and desperately wanted to impress his wealthy brother-in-law. He signed his name on the dotted line without ever consulting me or conducting any independent legal research. I listened coldly as he explained the terrifying mechanics of the shadow syndicate agreement they had foolishly executed behind my back. The violent lenders possessed zero patience for delayed construction projects or empty familial promises. If Connor defaults on this massive short-term loan, the criminal organization will legally seize every single asset tied to the guarantor. Derek sobbed uncontrollably as he confessed that his own beautiful suburban home would be the very first property targeted for violent liquidation. He then looked at me with profound terror in his watery eyes and delivered the final crushing detail of their reckless financial gamble. He admitted that Connor had cunningly attached my own primary city residence as the secondary collateral for the syndicate payout. My foolish son had willingly handed ruthless criminals the legal keys to my entire livelihood just to appease a white con artist. Derek begged for my immediate financial assistance to cover the impending default. The dangerous men funding the shadow syndicate were already demanding their first exorbitant payment, and neither Connor nor Derek had the necessary capital available right now. Derek realized his desperate pleas for financial salvation were falling upon completely deaf ears and quickly shifted his cowardly strategy. He leaned across the sticky table and decided to betray his own sister in a miserable attempt to save himself from my wrath. He lowered his voice into a conspiratorial whisper and revealed a significantly darker truth gestating inside our fractured family. He told me that Ebony and Connor were actively coordinating a vicious psychological ambush against me tomorrow morning. They had secretly hired an unethical private psychiatrist who specialized in producing fraudulent cognitive diagnoses for wealthy clients seeking rapid inheritance transfers. They planned to march this corrupt doctor directly into my living room under the thin guise of conducting a standard grief counseling session. Their ultimate goal was to completely strip away my personal autonomy by having me declared legally incompetent due to severe bereavement and advanced age. Once the psychiatrist stamped the forged paperwork, Connor would immediately assume total legal guardianship over my entire estate. This ruthless maneuver would effortlessly solve their massive syndicate problem by allowing Connor to legally liquidate my assets without requiring my physical signature or personal consent. They intended to permanently lock me inside a sterile assisted living facility, while they freely plundered the vast wealth Gwendolyn and I had meticulously accumulated over 4 long decades. The sheer malice of their calculated medical ambush extinguished any remaining paternal empathy I harbored for my treacherous children. They viewed my profound grief as a convenient operational weakness waiting to be mercilessly exploited for their own selfish gain. Derek finished his miserable confession and stared at me with fearful expectation, hoping his treacherous intelligence report would somehow buy back my fatherly affection and secure his immediate rescue from the violent local mob right away this very night. I stood up slowly from the cracked vinyl booth and looked down at the weeping man I once proudly called my son. Derek was crying openly into his trembling hands while begging for my unconditional forgiveness and immediate financial protection. I felt absolutely nothing for him but profound disgust and chilling indifference. I calmly buttoned my tailored suit jacket and informed him that our familial bond was completely and permanently severed. I explicitly told him that he chose his own destructive path by aligning himself with a greedy predator like Connor. I gathered the terrifying syndicate documents from the table and left Derek sobbing loudly alone inside the desolate roadside diner. I walked out into the pouring rain and climbed back into my waiting vehicle with extreme singular focus. The imminent threat of a psychological ambush required a swift and brutal countermeasure. I could not simply wait in my house for Connor to spring his pathetic medical trap tomorrow morning. I aggressively accelerated onto the dark highway and drove directly toward the Elite State Medical Center located on the wealthy northern side of the city. The chief of psychiatry at this prestigious hospital was a brilliant man whose career I had quietly funded decades ago. I needed to leverage that old debt immediately to secure my own irrefutable clinical weapon before the morning sun breached the horizon. Time was rapidly slipping away as I navigated through the slick, wet streets with dangerous precision. I had to undergo a rigorous, comprehensive cognitive evaluation tonight to definitively prove my flawless mental acuity. A certified time-stamped neurological document from the highest medical authority would serve as an impenetrable legal shield against their pathetic institutionalization scheme. The ultimate battle for my freedom and Gwendolyn's hidden legacy had officially commenced right now, this very night. The harsh morning sun pierced through the heavy living room curtains just as the front door swung open without a single knock. Connor and my daughter Ebony marched directly into my home as if they already owned the very floorboards beneath their designer shoes. They were closely followed by a slick, middle-aged man carrying a dark leather medical briefcase and wearing a sharply tailored suit that screamed of unethical corporate ambition rather than genuine medical practice. I remained seated in my favorite armchair holding a cooling cup of black coffee while the 3 intruders deliberately positioned themselves to physically corner me against the far wall. Connor immediately plastered a sickeningly fake expression of deep familial concern across his arrogant white face. He took a slow, dramatic step forward and began speaking to me in a hushed, patronizing tone, typically reserved for soothing, frightened toddlers. He claimed they were acting strictly out of profound love and overwhelming worry for my rapidly deteriorating mental health following the tragic death of my beloved Gwendolyn. He introduced the silent stranger as Dr. Eris Thorne, a highly exclusive private psychiatric specialist whom Connor had personally hired to evaluate my psychological stability this morning. Ebony stood rigidly beside her husband, nodding along to his blatant lies while refusing to make direct eye contact with her father. Connor gently placed his hand upon the shoulder of the doctor and gave a subtle but undeniable physical signal to initiate the unprovoked medical ambush. The corrupt physician stepped forward with a predatory smile and opened his expensive briefcase on my pristine mahogany coffee table. They fully expected a tired, grieving widower to easily surrender to their coordinated psychological manipulation. They had absolutely no idea they were walking blindly into a perfectly fortified defensive trap. I watched them silently. Dr. Thorne withdrew a silver pen and a thick notepad before launching directly into his highly insulting interrogation. He paced slowly across my living room rug and began asking me incredibly condescending questions designed specifically to create the false illusion of severe cognitive decline. He asked me to repeatedly verify the current date and requested that I recite my own home address backwards. He then aggressively pivoted toward my personal finances by demanding I calculate complex hypothetical interest rates regarding my various investment accounts. He deliberately twisted my brief moments of silence into supposed evidence of profound mental confusion. He twisted his words to make it appear as though my natural grief was actually a dangerous clinical pathology completely destroying my brain. Ebony dramatically collapsed onto the velvet couch and began performing a truly pathetic theatrical display of deep sorrow. She continuously dabbed her perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief while loudly weeping about how much she missed her strong, capable father. I observed her closely and noticed the glaring reflection of her cellular phone screen illuminating her tearless face. She was actively scrolling through social media feeds and online shopping catalogs while openly participating in the ruthless psychological assassination of her own father. Connor stood firmly behind the corrupt doctor with his arms securely crossed over his chest, projecting an aura of absolute legal authority. They aggressively bombarded me with overlapping questions, hoping to manufacture a momentary lapse in my concentration. They desperately needed me to stumble over a single word or forget a minor financial detail to justify their fraudulent diagnosis. Their entire strategy relied entirely upon my silent submission and my supposed inability to defend myself against medical jargon. I let them ramble endlessly, while I calmly prepared to drop my ultimate devastating countermeasure on them. I patiently allowed the arrogant doctor to exhaust his entire script of manipulative psychiatric questions without offering a single word of protest. Connor smiled triumphantly, assuming my prolonged silence was the ultimate proof of my rapid mental decline. I waited until Dr. Thorne finally clicked his silver pen shut and boldly declared that I was suffering from severe pathological dementia requiring immediate institutionalization. I slowly placed my coffee cup down onto the side table and stood up to my full, imposing height. The sudden commanding shift in my physical posture instantly erased the smug smiles from their treacherous faces. I reached deliberately inside my suit jacket and retrieved a thick sealed envelope bearing the official crest of the elite state medical center. I tossed the heavy envelope directly onto the mahogany coffee table, allowing it to land loudly against the corrupt doctor's leather briefcase. I smoothly explained that I had personally visited the chief of psychiatry at the state hospital exactly 4 hours before their pathetic little ambush began. I ordered Dr. Thorne to open the envelope and read the certified, time-stamped neurological evaluation resting inside. The comprehensive clinical document contained undeniable scientific proof that my brain was functioning at peak optimal capacity without a single trace of cognitive degradation. I watched the corrupt doctor quickly scan the prestigious signatures, verifying my absolutely flawless mental acuity. The irrefutable medical evidence instantly transformed his fraudulent diagnosis into a blatant act of documented medical malpractice. He suddenly realized he was holding a certified document drafted by the most powerful medical authority in the entire region. I had flawlessly preempted their cowardly institutionalization scheme and built an impenetrable legal shield around my mind. Connor stared at the medical papers, completely paralyzed by the brilliant speed of my silent retaliation right here this morning. I stepped closer to Dr. Thorne and clearly articulated the devastating professional consequences currently awaiting him. I calmly informed him that my aggressive attorney Evelyn was already drafting a comprehensive formal complaint to submit directly to the state medical board. I explained that she possessed sufficient irrefutable evidence to permanently revoke his prestigious medical license before the week concluded. The corrupt physician dropped the certified evaluation onto the table as if the crisp white paper had suddenly caught fire. Absolute panic completely overwhelmed his previously confident demeanor as he realized his lucrative career was about to be entirely annihilated. He frantically snapped his leather briefcase shut without uttering a single word of defense or justification. He practically sprinted out of my living room and fled through the front door, abandoning his wealthy clients to face my wrath alone. Ebony abruptly stopped her fake theatrical crying and stared at the empty doorway in utter shock. Connor turned his furious red face toward me, realizing his carefully constructed legal scheme had failed spectacularly. The absolute destruction of his institutionalization plan meant he could no longer seize my vast assets quietly through the court system. His massive syndicate debt was rapidly bleeding him dry, and his desperate legal avenues were now permanently barricaded. I stared into his deeply hateful eyes and recognized the dangerous turning point we had officially reached. The total collapse of his white-collar manipulation meant Connor would inevitably resort to brutal physical violence to save his own miserable life from the violent shadow syndicate. I ordered him and my treacherous daughter to exit my property immediately before I called the authorities to report their pathetic trespassing. The vicious psychological war was over, and a significantly darker battle of pure survival had begun for our deeply fractured family here today. The evening descended upon my silent house like a suffocating shroud after the spectacular failure of the medical ambush. I sat completely alone in my dark living room and methodically reviewed the devastating events of the long day. A deep rumbling sound suddenly vibrated through the floorboards and interrupted my intense concentration. A heavy black sport utility vehicle drove aggressively over the curb and idled menacingly directly on my front lawn. The powerful headlights glared through the front windows and illuminated the pristine living room with a harsh, blinding beam. I did not panic or rush to lock the doors like a frightened victim. I remained perfectly still in my armchair and watched the unfolding threat with cold calculation. Two incredibly massive men stepped out of the idling vehicle wearing dark leather jackets and moving with predatory purpose. They were the violent debt collectors dispatched by the ruthless Shadow Syndicate to enforce the catastrophic loan Connor had foolishly secured. They walked deliberately toward my own front porch carrying a solid aluminum baseball bat. The larger enforcer casually raised the heavy weapon and violently smashed the glass fixture of my front porch light. The sharp sound of shattering glass echoed loudly across the quiet suburban street. Sparks showered down onto the wooden deck as the bulb exploded into a dozen jagged fragments. The blatant act of domestic vandalism was a highly calculated message designed to instill absolute psychological terror tonight. They wanted the defiant old man to understand the severe physical consequences of denying their powerful organization its rightful payout. I refused to grant them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. I sat entirely motionless in the dark and waited for their next aggressive move. The brutal reality of Connor and his criminal entanglement had officially arrived directly at my front door. The intimidating men did not attempt to forcefully breach the wooden threshold or violently kick down my sturdy front door. They simply approached the entryway with a terrifying silence that spoke volumes about their professional, violent nature. I heard the faint rustle of heavy paper sliding smoothly against the polished hardwood floor just beneath the doorframe. The large men immediately retreated toward their idling sport utility vehicle and drove away into the dark night without uttering a single verbal threat. I waited until the red taillights completely vanished from my quiet street before moving from my secure armchair. I walked cautiously toward the entryway and looked down at the thick, glossy photograph resting face up on the floor. I bent down and picked up the chilling image with completely steady hands. The high-resolution photograph clearly showed Derek walking out of his downtown corporate office earlier this very afternoon. A bright red circular target was maliciously drawn directly over my foolish son and his terrified face. A heavy piece of parchment paper was securely stapled to the back of the threatening photograph. I flipped the terrifying image over and read the cruel handwritten message scrawled in thick black ink. The Shadow Syndicate aggressively demanded that the full beach property transfer be legally completed and finalized by this upcoming Friday evening. The note explicitly promised that any further delay or resistance would force Derek to pay the outstanding debt using his own physical blood. Connor had recklessly transformed a simple financial swindle into a deadly hostage situation involving my only male heir. I stared intensely at the chilling photograph and recognized the monumental stakes of this newly declared war. The violent predators had formally issued their final ultimatum and guaranteed absolute destruction for my deeply fractured family unit entirely tonight. I firmly placed the terrifying photograph onto the side table and marched deliberately toward my secure basement office. I stepped carefully over the shattered wooden door frame and sat down at my heavy mahogany desk. I quickly booted up my encrypted computer and accessed the hidden security camera system recording the exterior perimeter of my home. Gwendolyn and I had discreetly installed multiple high-definition lenses directly into the brick masonry years ago. I reviewed the digital footage and watched the heavy sport utility vehicle pull onto my manicured lawn. The advanced camera perfectly captured the unmasked faces of both violent enforcers as they aggressively smashed my porch light. I paused the clear video feed and zoomed in tightly on the rear bumper of their idling black truck. The license plate was completely visible and entirely legible under the bright street lamp illumination. I instantly exported the damning digital file and securely backed up the raw footage to a remote cloud server. I absolutely refused to be intimidated by a group of cowardly criminals hiding behind baseball bats and cheap threats. They foolishly believed a grieving widower would naturally surrender his entire coastal estate simply to protect an ungrateful, cowardly son. I reached for my cellular phone and dialed Evelyn immediately to initiate the ultimate legal trap. I rapidly explained the violent ultimatum delivered by the syndicate and provided her with the visible license plate numbers. I explicitly ordered my brilliant lawyer to execute the final preparation phases of our hidden defensive strategy before morning arrived. I commanded Evelyn to securely lock down all possible avenues of escape for Connor and his greedy wife. The ruthless Shadow Syndicate had just handed me the precise legal ammunition required to completely obliterate my treacherous son-in-law, forever ending this conflict today. I firmly terminated the confidential call with Evelyn and stared at the digital clock glowing brightly on my desk. The intricate trap was now fully operational, but I desperately needed to ensure my arrogant enemies walked willingly into the steel jaws. I picked up my cellular phone again and slowly dialed my daughter Ebony. I waited patiently as the line rang repeatedly before she finally answered with a sharp, annoyed greeting. I deliberately softened my voice and injected a trembling breath into my lungs to project extreme physical frailty. I adopted the pathetic persona of a broken, defeated old man completely overwhelmed by catastrophic grief and mounting domestic pressure. I told her in a highly convincing whisper that the violent events of the evening had entirely exhausted my remaining spiritual strength. I claimed the horrific reality of losing Gwendolyn was finally crushing my spirit, and I could no longer fight this difficult real estate battle. I formally promised to surrender the lucrative coastal property entirely to Connor and his mysterious corporate investors this upcoming Friday evening. I falsely stated that my only remaining desire was to rapidly resolve the dangerous financial debt and protect our fragile family from further violence. Ebony eagerly devoured every single word of my masterful performance without demonstrating any genuine concern for my supposed mental collapse. Her voice instantly shifted from annoyance to greedy triumph as she rapidly agreed to arrange a formal meeting at a private luxury restaurant on Friday night to execute the final property transfer. She ended the brief phone call quickly, clearly rushing to inform her husband that their cruel intimidation tactics had successfully broken my will. I placed the phone down and smiled coldly into the darkness, knowing the lethal bait was officially swallowed whole tonight. The end begins right now. The morning after my deceptive phone call to my daughter, I arrived at the imposing granite steps of the First Federal Reserve Building downtown. Evelyn and DeAndre were already waiting by the heavy revolving doors with serious expressions masking their anticipation. We completely bypassed the crowded public teller lines and walked directly toward the restricted administrative elevators. Evelyn flashed a platinum security credential to a stern armed guard who immediately granted us access to the subterranean levels. We descended silently into the reinforced bedrock beneath the bustling city streets. The heavy steel doors of the underground vault hissed open to reveal rows of impenetrable titanium deposit boxes. DeAndre produced a small brass key from his tailored jacket pocket while Evelyn handed the vault manager a notarized death certificate. The manager synchronized his master key with DeAndre and unlocked a massive compartment securely assigned to my late wife. I reached inside the dark metal cavity and retrieved a heavy sealed envelope bearing Gwendolyn's elegant handwriting. My fingers broke the wax seal to reveal the true updated deed to the coastal property. The pristine document clearly outlined the massive multi-million-dollar technology academy sitting on that land. It legally designated Gwendolyn as the absolute owner and explicitly named me as the sole inheritor of the entire commercial enterprise upon her passing. I stared at the irrefutable legal parchment that completely invalidated the outdated fraudulent deed Connor had brazenly stolen from my basement office. My brilliant wife had meticulously secured this technological fortress through federal property registries that completely superseded local municipal records. Holding the authentic documentation in my hands provided a profound surge of righteous clarity. The incredibly dangerous Shadow Syndicate was currently holding a worthless piece of paper completely devoid of any actual market value whatsoever right here today now. Evelyn swiftly directed us toward a private conference room located deep inside the subterranean banking facility. She retrieved a thick stack of specialized legal documents from her briefcase and spread them across the polished glass table. The paperwork detailed the immediate creation of an ironclad, irrevocable federal trust specifically designed to permanently shield high-value assets from any external vulnerabilities. I sat down and systematically transferred the true deed of the Coastal Technology Academy directly into the absolute protection of this new entity. I did not stop my defensive maneuvers there because Connor had aggressively threatened my entire livelihood just days prior. I fiercely signed over the legal title to my expansive city home, ensuring my primary residence was completely locked away from his predatory reach. I systematically transferred every single dollar from my personal checking accounts and long-term retirement portfolios straight into the untouchable federal vault. Evelyn confirmed the complex legal structure officially designated me as the sole acting director holding ultimate operational authority over the massive shielded fortune. The irrevocable nature of the specific trust meant these assets could absolutely never be seized by any greedy family member or aggressive private creditor moving forward. Local municipal judges possessed zero jurisdictional power to alter or dismantle the protective framework surrounding my vast new corporate empire. The Shadow Syndicate could violently demand repayment from Connor all they wanted, but they could never legally touch a single brick belonging to my protected estate. I meticulously reviewed each page to guarantee my ungrateful children were permanently excised from inheriting any portion of my hidden wealth. I boldly signed the final signature line with completely steady hands while cementing an invisible defensive perimeter around my entire existence. The ultimate financial trap was fully armed and actively waiting for my treacherous enemies tonight. DeAndre reached into his sleek leather messenger bag and withdrew a second highly classified folder containing heavily encrypted banking logs. He solemnly handed the thick dossier across the conference table to me without uttering a single word of hesitation. My brilliant property manager had utilized his advanced technological resources to systematically penetrate the hidden corporate firewalls surrounding Connor and his failing construction firm. I opened the manila folder and began dissecting the illicit offshore transaction records meticulously printed on the crisp white pages. The horrifying financial reality of my daughter's pathetic marriage was laid entirely bare beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the underground vault. Connor was not merely suffering from minor business setbacks related to a volatile commercial real estate market downturn. He was actively battling a severe degenerate gambling addiction that had completely consumed his entire professional livelihood over the past 3 years. I tracked the aggressive illicit transfers flowing directly from their joint accounts into untraceable offshore casinos and illegal sporting syndicates. The most sickening revelation struck me like a violent physical blow to my chest when I examined the specific source of his recent stolen capital. Connor had secretly liquidated the extensive college trust funds Ebony had joyfully established for their future unborn children. He systematically siphoned those deeply sacred savings accounts down to absolute zero simply to temporarily cover his massive, staggering gambling debts. Ebony was completely oblivious to the horrific fact that her arrogant husband had already bankrupted their entire future before it even began. She blindly supported a ruthless financial parasite while proudly participating in the cruel psychological assassination of her own grieving father. Her profound arrogance and unwavering loyalty to a monstrous thief had successfully transformed her into the ultimate tragic victim of his endless, insatiable greed right here on this day. Evelyn meticulously gathered the signed federal trust documents and officially registered them into the heavily guarded government database terminal. The complex legal steel trap was firmly closed around my magnificent coastal estate and my pristine city home forever. I systematically loaded Connor's highly incriminating gambling records and Derek's disastrous shadow syndicate loan contract into a secure leather briefcase. I stood up from the glass conference table, knowing I now held absolute untouchable power over the miserable enemies desperately plotting my violent demise. They had spent the entire week aggressively celebrating their imaginary triumph while foolishly believing my fragile phone call was a genuine surrender. Connor was likely purchasing expensive champagne on borrowed syndicate credit to celebrate his impending hostile corporate takeover of my life. Ebony was undoubtedly dreaming about luxurious renovations, while blissfully ignoring the horrific financial ruin her husband had secretly orchestrated behind her back. Derek remained paralyzed by absolute cowardice while completely failing to realize that his own father possessed the sole key to his survival. They were all blindly marching toward an epic confrontation equipped with nothing but transparent lies and extreme arrogance. I walked out of the subterranean bank vault feeling an incredibly powerful surge of righteous adrenaline coursing violently through my older veins. Evelyn and DeAndre trailed closely behind me, serving as the fiercely loyal lieutenants of my newly secured corporate empire today. I watched the golden afternoon sunlight slowly fade across the bustling city skyline, signaling the inevitable arrival of my final brutal reckoning. Friday evening was rapidly approaching, and the private luxury restaurant would soon become the ultimate execution chamber for their boundless greed. I firmly gripped the leather briefcase containing their total annihilation and walked boldly forward to definitively finish this ugly war tonight with absolute precision and unyielding resolve right now. Friday evening arrived with a chilling gust of coastal wind sweeping through the bustling downtown avenues. Connor had aggressively secured the most exclusive private dining room inside the city's absolute finest luxury culinary establishment. He had foolishly financed the exorbitant reservation entirely on borrowed syndicate credit to project an overwhelming illusion of boundless wealth and unyielding corporate success. He sat squarely at the head of the long mahogany table, radiating an incredibly toxic aura of pure, arrogant triumph. He proudly adjusted the cuffs of his expensive designer jacket and smiled like a conquering king who had successfully crushed his greatest enemy. He truly believed he had effortlessly outsmarted a grieving old man and secured his ultimate financial salvation. Ebony sat close beside her treacherous husband, looking profoundly relieved that the manufactured familial tension was finally reaching a supposedly peaceful conclusion. She wore a stunning evening gown purchased with stolen funds and sipped premium champagne while completely ignoring the monumental devastation hovering directly over her own future. She remained blissfully unaware that her beloved husband had already secretly liquidated her future children's sacred college accounts to cover his miserable, degenerate gambling debts. Derek occupied a dark, shadowy corner of the luxurious private room far away from the celebrating couple. He sat rigidly in a heavy leather chair, sweating profusely through his wrinkled dress shirt. His terrified eyes constantly darted toward the heavy oak doors, anticipating imminent physical violence. He compulsively wiped his damp forehead with a cocktail napkin while silently praying for a miraculous escape from the impending syndicate bloodbath. He understood the absolute gravity of the terrifying hostage situation, but lacked the fundamental courage to openly warn his oblivious sister about the ruthless criminals currently sitting across from them. The stage was perfectly set for total, absolute destruction tonight. 3 dangerous syndicate investors occupied the opposite side of the extensive dining table wearing exceptionally expensive tailored suits. They completely failed to disguise their highly violent criminal nature beneath the fragile, polished veneer of legitimate corporate real estate executives. Their thick, muscular necks and heavily scarred knuckles constantly betrayed their true, ruthless professions to anyone paying close attention. They continuously sipped imported scotch and aggressively eyed the vacant chair reserved for me, like incredibly hungry wolves waiting to finally devour a trapped, vulnerable meal. Connor gleefully poured them additional drinks while enthusiastically promising a swift, seamless property transfer, guaranteeing massive offshore profits for their shadowy criminal organization. Suddenly, the heavy brass handles of the private dining room doors turned downward with a sharp metallic click that instantly silenced the boisterous conversation. I walked confidently into the luxurious room, radiating absolute power and undeniable authority. I wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit paired with a crisp white shirt and a striking crimson silk tie. I stood incredibly tall and completely straight, absolutely destroying the pathetic illusion of the broken, frail old man I had meticulously portrayed during our previous telephone conversation. My heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed loudly across the polished marble floor as I approached the silent table. Ebony audibly gasped and spilled several drops of her premium champagne directly onto her expensive evening gown. She stared at my incredibly sharp, commanding appearance with absolute terrifying realization dawning rapidly across her wide eyes. The aggressive syndicate investors immediately stopped smiling and slowly lowered their heavy crystal glasses onto the polished mahogany wood. Connor felt his arrogant confidence evaporate instantly as he desperately tried to comprehend the shocking physical transformation unfolding right before his very eyes. The old vulnerable victim was entirely gone, and the real predator had finally arrived tonight. Connor swallowed hard and desperately attempted to quickly regain his shattered composure before the violent investors completely lost their limited patience. He aggressively cleared his dry throat and forced a remarkably unconvincing smile across his pale, sweating face. He reached inside his tailored designer jacket and retrieved a heavy gold luxury pen that perfectly matched his shallow, materialistic personality. He grabbed the thick stack of forged property transfer documents resting nearby and smoothly slid them across the polished mahogany table directly toward my empty chair. He then raised his crystal glass of expensive imported wine high into the air and loudly proposed an incredibly condescending toast dedicated to maintaining strong family unity during difficult emotional times. He boldly proclaimed that making the smart financial choice today would permanently secure a highly prosperous future for every single person sitting inside this magnificent private dining room. The brutal syndicate boss sitting directly across the long table remained completely silent while menacingly glaring at my face. Connor finished his deeply insulting toast and aggressively demanded that I sign the binding legal papers immediately right this very second, so the hungry guests could finally order their lavish gourmet meals. He genuinely believed his surrounding mob muscle would easily force my total compliance regardless of my remarkably sharp physical appearance tonight. Ebony stared nervously at the thick stack of fraudulent legal documents resting inches away from my steady hands. Derek whimpered quietly from his shadowy corner seat, terrified that any sudden movement might trigger an immediate violent execution. I slowly lowered myself into the plush leather chair positioned at the opposite end of the long dining table. I stared deeply into the greedy, expectant eyes of the foolish little boy attempting to steal my life. I calmly prepared to deliver my final judgment right now. I slowly reached across the smooth mahogany surface and carefully picked up the heavy luxury pen waiting beside the fraudulent transfer documents. I deliberately turned the expensive writing instrument over in my steady hands while meticulously examining the intricate gold trim shining brightly beneath the crystal chandelier. The arrogant syndicate boss leaned forward in his leather chair, fully expecting me to rapidly sign my massive fortune entirely away out of pure terror. Connor smiled triumphantly, assuming his highly orchestrated intimidation campaign had finally broken my unyielding spirit tonight. I tightened my fierce grip on both ends of the solid metal barrel and violently snapped the expensive pen entirely in half. A loud, incredibly sharp crack instantly shattered the heavy silence hanging thickly inside the private dining room. Black ink splattered wildly across the crisp white tablecloth and ruined the top page of the forged real estate deed resting before me. I casually tossed the violently broken, jagged metal pieces directly onto the exact center of the mahogany table and looked directly into the highly dangerous eyes of the ruthless syndicate boss. The surrounding criminal investors immediately tensed their muscular shoulders while fiercely gripping the sharp edges of their heavy crystal glasses. I leaned forward and boldly informed every single person sitting inside the luxurious room that my immense coastal property was now legally permanently untouchable. The time for hidden family manipulation and cowardly backdoor deception had officially completely ended right here tonight. The intense physical confrontation permanently transitioned from quiet, fraudulent whispers into a bloody arena of open, ruthless warfare against an extremely dangerous, brutal shadow empire operating here. I possessed the absolute legal high ground, and I fiercely promised the highly dangerous men that Connor alone would ultimately bleed for his own massive unpaid debts starting right now today. I shifted my intense focus entirely away from my pathetic son-in-law and locked my unwavering gaze directly onto the deeply scarred face of the syndicate boss. I completely ignored Connor as he desperately attempted to interject his own frantic justifications into the rapidly escalating confrontation. I addressed the dangerous criminal leader with a chillingly calm baritone voice that demanded absolute respect within the luxurious private dining room. I bluntly informed the muscular investor that his supposedly lucrative commercial real estate deal was nothing more than a monumental corporate illusion manufactured by a deeply indebted fraudster. I clearly explained that Connor was actively trying to sell their ruthless organization a completely worthless piece of forged paper holding absolutely zero legal weight or financial market value. I smoothly reached inside my tailored suit jacket and retrieved a crisp, high-resolution photocopy of the heavily outdated stolen deed. I placed the fraudulent document flat against the pristine white tablecloth and firmly slid it across the long mahogany table directly toward the silent syndicate boss. The heavy piece of paper glided effortlessly past the shattered luxury pen and stopped exactly inches away from the criminal's heavy crystal glass. I watched the ruthless leader slowly lower his imported scotch and stare suspiciously at the outdated property description outlining a barren plot of worthless coastal dirt. I boldly declared that Connor had brazenly stolen this archaic document directly from my private basement office while pretending to mourn my late wife at her funeral repast. I explicitly warned the powerful syndicate investors that any financial transaction based upon this fraudulent paperwork would immediately trigger an aggressive federal investigation into their highly illicit shadow banking operations tonight. The dangerous men sitting across the table simultaneously shifted their hostile attention directly toward Connor right now, this second. Connor suddenly jumped up from his plush leather chair with shocking aggression while his arrogant face turned a vibrant shade of furious red. He slammed both of his sweating hands violently onto the mahogany table and began loudly shouting that I was tragically losing my fractured mind once again. He desperately attempted to salvage his collapsing corporate charade by falsely claiming that my immense grief was causing severe paranoid delusions tonight. He pointed an accusatory finger directly at my chest and aggressively ordered the dangerous syndicate investors to completely ignore my supposedly crazed ramblings. Ebony immediately panicked upon seeing her luxurious future rapidly disintegrating and physically reached across the expensive white tablecloth to grab my tailored suit sleeve. She began pathetically begging me to immediately stop embarrassing our proud family in front of these incredibly important financial guests. She whined that my confrontational behavior was actively ruining their massive business opportunity and pleaded with me to simply sign the legal documents quietly. She completely failed to comprehend the deadly reality of the ruthless men sitting silently across the beautiful dining room table right now. I stared coldly down at her perfectly manicured fingers gripping my expensive gray jacket and felt absolute disgust boiling fiercely within my older veins. I inhaled a deep breath of the sterile restaurant air and loudly delivered a single sharp command that instantly echoed against the crystal chandelier hanging above us. I ordered my treacherous daughter to shut her greedy mouth permanently before I officially destroyed her entire pathetic life right here tonight. The sheer booming volume and absolute lethal authority radiating from my deep baritone voice instantly paralyzed every single person occupying the private room. Ebony released my jacket and quickly sank backward into her chair, completely silenced by my undeniable power right away today. I turned my imposing physical presence back toward the dangerous syndicate leader and calmly reached into my interior suit pocket for the second time. I flawlessly retrieved a thick stack of pristine aerial photographs showcasing the magnificent luxury technology academy currently sitting upon the highly contested coastal land. I boldly dropped the stunning glossy images directly onto the center of the mahogany table, allowing them to rapidly spread across the ruined property documents. The syndicate boss leaned forward and stared intensely at the highly advanced architectural structures sprawling across the beautiful, pristine beachfront property. I confidently announced to the entire silent room that the authentic coastal estate was currently operating as a massive, highly profitable commercial enterprise. I firmly locked eyes with the ruthless criminal leader and explicitly revealed that the true legitimate market value of this specific property was exactly $30 million today. The staggering financial revelation instantly sucked all the remaining oxygen straight out of the luxurious private dining room. Connor visibly swayed on his feet as his completely fraudulent narrative was violently dismantled before his most dangerous financial creditors. I loudly proclaimed that the updated authentic deed to this incredible technological fortress was permanently secured inside an impenetrable federal trust account. I officially declared that my pathetic son-in-law possessed absolutely no legal claim to a single solitary brick located anywhere on that lucrative coastal property. Connor was legally prevented from ever transferring, liquidating, or borrowing against the $30 million academy, regardless of his severe gambling debts. The violent mobsters slowly processed the devastating reality that their supposedly guaranteed collateral simply did not legally exist within Connor's miserable empty portfolio. The grand majestic illusion of his boundless corporate wealth had finally entirely evaporated, leaving him completely exposed tonight, right here in this very room. The ruthless syndicate boss slowly turned his massive neck and directed his incredibly cold, violent eyes directly toward the trembling man standing at the head of the long mahogany table. The sudden terrifying shift in the heavy atmosphere was physically suffocating as absolute murderous intent rapidly flooded the private dining room. Connor visibly shrank backward against the expensive silk wallpaper while desperately attempting to formulate a single coherent sentence to defend his pathetic existence. He hopelessly stammered through a series of broken, fragmented excuses, frantically searching for any possible escape route from this disastrous confrontation. The imposing criminal leader completely ignored the cowardly apologies and slowly picked up a sharp steak knife resting beside his untouched crystal wine glass. He methodically dragged the polished silver blade back and forth across the pristine white tablecloth while calculating the precise method of his imminent brutal retaliation. The underlying tension inside the luxurious room transformed instantly, changing Connor from an arrogant, confident predator into entirely desperate, helpless prey. He finally realized his monumental corporate lie was now fully aggressively exposed, leaving him permanently trapped within a deadly cage constructed entirely by his own boundless greed. Ebony remained completely paralyzed in her plush leather chair, entirely terrified by the monstrous, violent men her husband had recklessly invited into their shallow lives tonight. Derek continued weeping silently in his dark corner, totally overwhelmed by the horrific, violent reality closing tightly around our fractured family. I stood flawlessly calm amidst the swirling chaos, watching the brutal syndicate enforcers slowly rise from their expensive dining chairs with lethal precision. The invisible legal steel trap had permanently snapped shut, locking my treacherous enemies inside an inescapable nightmare today. I simply buttoned my tailored charcoal suit jacket and calmly prepared to proudly witness my ultimate vindication unfold right now. Ebony frantically leaped upward from her plush leather dining chair and desperately attempted to defend her completely paralyzed husband against my devastating corporate revelations tonight. She aggressively slammed her perfectly manicured hands against the pristine white tablecloth and loudly claimed that the magnificent coastal technology facility rightfully belonged to our immediate family. She passionately argued that Connor possessed the natural inherent right to legally manage the highly lucrative business enterprise because he was formally married into our established family lineage. She blindly insisted that his temporary financial setbacks were completely normal market fluctuations and aggressively demanded that I instantly unlock the federal trust account to save his failing construction firm right now. Her profound arrogance and sickening sense of entitlement completely blinded her to the incredibly dangerous syndicate predators, sitting silently across the mahogany table sharpening their metaphorical knives. She actually believed her loud whining and childish temper tantrums would easily force me to surrender a $30 million corporate empire directly into the bloody hands of a degenerate gambling addict. I slowly shifted my intense physical focus entirely away from her terrified husband and locked my unwavering, unforgiving gaze directly onto my deeply treacherous daughter. I stared coldly into her panicked brown eyes and watched her arrogant posture immediately begin to crumble beneath the crushing weight of my absolute silent fury. I felt absolutely zero paternal warmth or protective instinct remaining inside my older heart for this incredibly greedy woman standing before me today. She had maliciously conspired to permanently lock her own grieving father inside a sterile mental institution simply to rapidly accelerate her personal inheritance timeline. I calmly prepared to systematically destroy her entire perfectly manicured suburban fantasy using the exact same ruthless precision I had just utilized against her pathetic criminal husband during this fateful dinner. I smoothly reached inside my sleek leather briefcase and retrieved the highly classified financial dossier DeAndre had successfully acquired from the subterranean federal bank vault. I forcefully slapped the thick stack of heavily encrypted banking records directly onto the polished mahogany table right in front of her trembling fingers. I aggressively shoved the damning papers straight into her hands and loudly commanded her to read the brightly highlighted transaction lines. I fiercely ordered her to closely examine the exact numerical destinations where her beloved husband had been secretly funneling their entire marital wealth over the past 3 long years. Ebony slowly lowered her eyes toward the crisp white pages and immediately saw the horrifying, irrefutable truth meticulously documented across multiple illicit offshore accounts. I ruthlessly forced her to loudly acknowledge the specific dates when Connor deliberately drained her sacred college savings funds intended entirely for their future unborn children. I pointed a steady finger at the undeniable evidence showing how he had aggressively maxed out several secret credit cards completely registered under her own personal name. He had systematically transformed her pristine financial identity into a massive, toxic wasteland, strictly to sustain his severe, degenerate gambling addiction behind her back. I calmly explained that her arrogant husband was absolutely nothing more than a pathetic, broke criminal rapidly drowning beneath a massive mountain of dangerous syndicate debt today. The ruthless shadow investors sitting directly across the luxurious table smiled coldly as they proudly watched my beautiful daughter finally discover the monstrous reality of her perfectly fabricated suburban marriage. Her precious, wealthy lifestyle was a completely hollow illusion carefully constructed upon endless mountains of stolen capital and profound domestic deceit. I forced her to visually digest every single catastrophic mathematical calculation permanently sealing her financial doom right here inside this private restaurant. Ebony frantically scanned the devastating numbers explicitly printed across the official corporate documents, while her breathing instantly escalated into a full-blown panic attack. The monumental realization of her absolute ruin struck her physical body like a violent, crushing blow delivered directly to her fragile chest. The staggering negative balances printed in harsh red ink brutally confirmed that her beautifully manicured life had rapidly dissolved into pure nothingness. She discovered that her supposedly perfect wealthy marriage was actually a terrifying financial prison constructed by a ruthless sociopathic liar standing entirely exposed tonight. The expansive dream home she proudly flaunted to her jealous friends was fully leveraged against massive illegal loans she could never possibly repay during her lifetime. The beautiful luxury vehicles she happily drove every single day were practically repossessed by dangerous underground mobsters, demanding immediate physical retribution. The crushing weight of absolute poverty suddenly descended upon her trembling shoulders as she completely digested the horrifying extent of his profound marital betrayal. She slowly turned her tear-stained face toward the pathetic coward sitting directly beside her, hoping desperately for a miraculous defensive explanation. She stared deeply into his terrified eyes and begged him to loudly deny the incredibly damaging financial theft I had just publicly presented. She desperately waited for her beloved husband to fiercely defend their sacred marital trust and magically explain away the catastrophic offshore gambling debts suffocating their entire future today. Connor absolutely refused to meet her frantic, desperate gaze and simply stared hopelessly down at the polished hardwood floor beneath his expensive leather designer shoes. His deafening silence served as the ultimate horrific confession, confirming every single devastating accusation meticulously outlined within the encrypted banking dossier. He had deliberately, completely destroyed her entire life simply to feed his own insatiable, reckless addictions right now. Ebony suddenly collapsed backward into her plush leather chair and began weeping uncontrollably as the inescapable reality of her total destruction permanently shattered her fragile ego. Her loud, pathetic sobs echoed sharply across the quiet, private dining room, while her trembling hands desperately covered her tear-streaked face in absolute, profound shame. I stood tall at the opposite end of the long mahogany table and felt absolutely zero paternal pity for the miserable, broken woman desperately crying before me tonight. I stared down at her ruined evening gown and coldly stated that her willing complicity in trying to maliciously institutionalize her own grieving father carried severe permanent consequences. I fiercely reminded her that she had brazenly prioritized her own shallow materialistic greed over the sacred familial bond we had proudly shared for her entire life. I clearly articulated that her unforgivable betrayal had instantly officially severed her from my extensive financial protection and permanently deleted her name from my wealthy estate forever. She had willfully chosen to blindly support a manipulative white predator while actively plotting to mercilessly steal the vast corporate empire her mother meticulously built for decades. I loudly proclaimed that she must now hopelessly suffer the horrific catastrophic consequences of choosing her fraudulent husband over the profound unconditional love of her own flesh and blood today. The heavily scarred syndicate enforcers slowly stood up from their expensive chairs and aggressively moved toward the weeping couple trapped at the head of the dark room. The violent shadow investors were absolutely finished waiting for their missing millions and clearly intended to forcefully extract their bloody payment right here tonight. I smoothly adjusted my tailored suit jacket and confidently walked out of the luxurious establishment, leaving my treacherous daughter drowning entirely within her own catastrophic ruin starting right now today. Derek desperately attempted to utilize the escalating emotional chaos as a convenient smokescreen to orchestrate his own cowardly escape from the luxurious private dining room. He slowly pushed his chair backward against the silk wallpaper and crept silently toward the heavy oak doors, hoping to completely vanish into the busy restaurant hallway unnoticed. I immediately shifted my unwavering attention away from my weeping daughter and loudly commanded my pathetic son to sit back down right now, this instant. My booming voice instantly paralyzed his trembling legs and forced him to freeze awkwardly near the expensive brass door handles. He slowly turned his sweating face toward the long mahogany table, looking absolutely terrified of the violent consequences rapidly closing in around him. I confidently addressed the dangerous syndicate investors sitting directly across the room and publicly exposed Derek as the willing legal guarantor for the catastrophic commercial loan. I explicitly detailed how my deeply foolish son had aggressively signed his own name on the fraudulent syndicate contract to officially secure the massive offshore funds for his treacherous brother-in-law. I clearly explained that Derek had recklessly bypassed standard banking protocols and voluntarily attached his pristine credit history to this monumentally doomed financial endeavor without ever conducting a single independent review. The ruthless criminal enforcers immediately shifted their cold, predatory gaze directly onto my trembling son standing helplessly near the exit. They rapidly processed the highly lucrative fact that Derek was legally bound to repay every single stolen dollar regardless of whether Connor possessed the actual liquid capital tonight. Derek swallowed incredibly hard as the inescapable reality of his monumentally stupid financial decision physically locked him inside the dangerous execution chamber. He slowly stumbled back toward his leather chair, completely trapped by his own profound cowardice and desperate, blinding greed today. The brutal syndicate boss leaned completely forward over the ruined property documents and produced a wicked, predatory grin that perfectly illuminated his violent criminal nature. He slowly drummed his heavily scarred fingers against the polished mahogany wood and confidently addressed the terrified man sweating profusely in the shadowy corner. He clearly stated that his highly dangerous organization demanded immediate physical repayment tonight, regardless of which specific family member actually provided the missing stolen funds. He explicitly promised that if Connor completely failed to deliver the required massive capital right now, then Derek's beautiful suburban house and pristine liquid assets were next on the bloody chopping block. The criminal leader smoothly explained that their aggressive collection methods would legally liquidate every single possession Derek currently owned before transitioning into far more ruthless physical consequences to settle the outstanding debt. Derek instantly shattered under the unbearable psychological pressure of the violent mafia ultimatum and dramatically dropped straight down onto his trembling knees right there on the expensive marble floor. He loudly began begging me to completely unlock the hidden federal trust account and immediately utilize the immense beach house wealth to desperately save his miserable life. He pathetically clasped his sweaty hands together and fiercely pleaded for unconditional fatherly salvation from the extremely violent financial nightmare he had willingly co-signed. He continuously whined that the ruthless shadow investors would physically destroy his beautiful family and aggressively seize his entire livelihood before the current weekend officially concluded. His loud, desperate sobbing practically echoed off the crystal chandelier above us as he frantically prayed for a miraculous, massive cash injection from the exact same father he had recently plotted to severely institutionalize. The criminal enforcers laughed coldly at the pathetic public display of absolute pure cowardice unfolding directly before their highly amused eyes. I stared directly down at the weeping man kneeling pathetically on the cold restaurant floor, and flatly refused to provide him with a single solitary dime of financial rescue. I maintained absolute icy composure as I loudly declared that cowardice was always a highly deliberate, active choice, rather than a simple momentary lapse in acceptable personal judgment. I fiercely reminded him that he had enthusiastically aligned himself with a blatant predator while secretly endorsing a vicious medical ambush designed to permanently rob his own grieving father. I clearly articulated that utilizing my heavily protected corporate wealth to immediately bail him out of this catastrophic situation would only teach him how to be a significantly more efficient coward in the future. He desperately needed to directly experience the incredibly severe burning consequences of his own monumental betrayal to truly comprehend the massive damage he had carelessly inflicted upon our sacred familial bonds. I coldly informed him that he voluntarily invited ruthless criminal elements into his suburban life and must now face the violent syndicate entirely on his own miserable terms without my impenetrable legal shield. I explicitly stated that my federal trust account remained permanently locked and entirely inaccessible to anyone attempting to quickly settle illicit gambling debts or fraudulent offshore loans today. I possessed the supreme financial capability to easily eradicate his entire dangerous mob problem with a single swift bank transfer, but I completely chose to fully withhold that saving grace tonight. I wanted him to vividly feel the suffocating terror of standing absolutely alone against highly monstrous consequences while completely stripped of his father's unconditional protective armor. I boldly stepped away from the mahogany table and formally abandoned my treacherous son to the exceedingly hungry wolves patiently circling his bleeding, ruined existence right now within this room. Derek completely broke down into hysterical, uncontrollable sobbing as the incredibly terrifying reality of his absolute impending destruction finally cemented itself firmly inside his panicked brain today. He aggressively scrambled upward from the polished marble floor and viciously lunged directly toward the arrogant man who had maliciously orchestrated this entire catastrophic nightmare here tonight. He began wildly screaming and loudly cursing Connor for deliberately ruining his pristine corporate life with a massive mountain of fraudulent lies and severely toxic gambling debts. The polished illusion of their deeply unified familial front permanently shattered beyond any possible hope of future reconciliation right here inside this luxurious private dining room. Ebony instantly jumped fiercely into the chaotic fray and aggressively shoved Derek backward while loudly screaming horrible defensive insults designed to desperately protect her deeply flawed sociopathic husband. Connor aggressively pushed back against both of his hysterical family members, while loudly blaming Ebony for demanding an incredibly expensive suburban lifestyle he could never legitimately afford on his own. The three treacherous individuals viciously turned on each other like entirely rabid animals trapped tightly inside a rapidly shrinking steel cage without any visible exit doors remaining open. They screamed horrifying personal insults and violently exposed years of deeply buried familial resentments while completely ignoring the highly dangerous syndicate enforcers, silently watching their pathetic physical brawl. I stood perfectly still near the shattered luxury pen and calmly watched the brutal emotional carnage unfold from a completely fortified position of absolute, untouchable legal immunity. I had flawlessly executed my defensive corporate strategy and successfully severed the rotting, infectious limbs currently tearing themselves completely apart directly in front of my very eyes. The vicious, greedy predators had foolishly attempted to blindly consume my massive hidden empire and ultimately devoured their own miserable souls instead of me tonight. Connor absolutely refused to accept his monumental defeat, despite the violent syndicate enforcers currently surrounding his shrinking physical space within the private dining room. He aggressively wiped the cold sweat from his pale forehead and desperately lunged forward across the ruined mahogany table to execute one final pathetic maneuver. His trembling hands violently tore through the interior pocket of his ruined designer jacket to retrieve another fraudulent legal document he had cowardly manufactured behind my back. He aggressively slammed a heavily forged power of attorney directly onto the polished wood while loudly screaming that he still permanently possessed absolute legal authority over my entire existence. He viciously shouted that this specific binding document completely superseded any federal trust account because it legally designated him as my primary financial guardian. He arrogantly threatened to personally march into the downtown federal courthouse first thing tomorrow morning to officially execute this fabricated legal instrument and ruthlessly seize every single liquid asset I currently owned. He fiercely proclaimed that local municipal judges would automatically grant his emergency request due to my supposedly severe mental decline and rapidly deteriorating psychological state. He desperately attempted to convince the dangerous shadow investors that this worthless piece of paper was an ironclad guarantee of their impending massive financial repayment. He wildly promised the ruthless criminals that he would violently drain my entire protected estate by tomorrow afternoon and personally hand them their missing offshore millions. His hysterical screaming echoed sharply against the crystal chandelier as he desperately tried to project a completely fake aura of absolute corporate dominance over my unyielding physical presence. He truly believed this cowardly legal ambush would instantly force my total submission and magically erase the monumental disaster rapidly unfolding around him. His boundless arrogance completely blinded him to my ultimate defensive countermeasure tonight. I completely ignored his frantic, ridiculous screaming and calmly reached deep inside my tailored suit trousers to slowly retrieve my encrypted mobile phone. I maintained steady, unwavering eye contact with the furious man while deliberately tapping the sleek, illuminated screen to access my highly secured digital files. I flawlessly bypassed the complex password protection and seamlessly connected my sophisticated device directly into the incredibly powerful surround sound Bluetooth speaker system installed throughout the luxurious private restaurant room. A soft electronic chime instantly resonated across the polished mahogany table, loudly confirming that my synchronized connection was completely successful and fully operational. I systematically navigated toward a deeply hidden audio folder containing a highly classified digital recording I had meticulously guarded for several extremely painful years. I firmly pressed the bright green play button, resting upon the smooth glass screen while sliding my phone perfectly flat onto the ruined white tablecloth. A sharp burst of brief metallic static briefly crackled through the expensive overhead speakers before suddenly transitioning into absolute crystal-clear audio perfection tonight. The unmistakable, elegant tone of my brilliant late wife Gwendolyn instantly flooded every single dark corner of the terrified dining room. Her remarkably calm, soothing voice resonated with profound, undeniable authority as she began speaking clearly from beyond the silent grave. She had intentionally created this specific digital testament several years ago, right before her incredibly sudden, unexpected physical passing shook my entire world. She possessed an incredibly sharp, intuitive mind and had actively utilized her final living moments to permanently document the horrifying truth regarding her deeply treacherous son-in-law. The sheer monumental impact of hearing her beautiful, familiar voice immediately sucked all remaining oxygen straight out of the suffocating enclosed space and firmly paralyzed every single treacherous enemy currently breathing nearby right now today. Gwendolyn's remarkably firm, unwavering voice continuously echoed throughout the incredibly silent private room, carrying the absolute profound weight of a brilliant, undeniable matriarch. She began meticulously detailing Connor's deeply manipulative, narcissistic nature while completely exposing the carefully crafted, fraudulent facade he had presented to our wealthy family. Her digital ghost explicitly outlined his massive, horrifying secret gambling debts and clearly described the violent underground criminal syndicates he had foolishly entangled himself with over several years. She fiercely explained how she had secretly hired specialized private investigators to comprehensively document his endless horrific lies long before her sudden medical emergency ever occurred. She boldly stated that discovering his absolute profound betrayal had completely shattered her maternal heart, but it had also instantly galvanized her ironclad defensive resolve. Gwendolyn confidently announced to the completely terrified room that she had proactively transferred every single solitary corporate asset permanently outside his greedy reaching fingers forever. She explicitly detailed the complex creation of the irrevocable federal trust account specifically designed to forever protect her monumental Coastal Technology Academy from his pathetic, degenerate addictions. She firmly proclaimed that her vast inherited wealth would absolutely never legally finance his miserable, destructive lifestyle or satisfy his incredibly dangerous mob creditors tonight. Hearing her incredibly powerful, commanding voice forcefully dismantle their entire pathetic existence instantly paralyzed both Connor and Ebony with pure, absolute, terrifying shock. They remained completely frozen in their plush leather chairs, staring blindly at the sleek mobile phone projecting their monumental doom across the polished mahogany table. Ebony physically trembled violently while finally comprehending that her brilliant mother had known the horrifying truth about her treacherous husband long before her incredibly tragic death. The massive, carefully protected lie was definitively violently destroyed, leaving them completely naked and entirely vulnerable before the extremely dangerous criminals here today. Gwendolyn's highly emotional digital recording rapidly approached its absolute final conclusion, as her incredibly steady voice softened into a deeply profoundly personal tone meant entirely for my ears alone. She gently addressed me directly through the expensive restaurant speakers and warmly expressed her incredibly massive, boundless love for the magnificent, long, beautiful life we had proudly successfully built together. She then abruptly shifted her brilliant tone backward into pure, cold, calculating defensive steel, while delivering one final chilling warning regarding our incredibly ungrateful, deeply toxic, treacherous children. She explicitly commanded me to permanently, mercilessly burn the entire bridge completely straight down into ash before either of the terrible, greedy children could ever manage to safely cross it. She fiercely demanded that I violently, severely cut them entirely off from my vast wealth and flawlessly protect my incredibly valuable sanity from their endless, pathetic, blood-sucking corporate manipulation today. A sharp, quick beep suddenly echoed throughout the luxurious dining room, signaling that the incredibly powerful audio file had officially permanently concluded right here on this completely fateful night. I slowly reached my steady hand across the ruined white tablecloth and calmly pushed a small button, turning the encrypted mobile phone entirely off right now. I leaned backward into my plush leather chair and confidently crossed my strong arms while silently surveying the absolute, complete psychological devastation currently completely radiating across the long mahogany table. Connor literally wept silently into his trembling, sweaty hands while Ebony stared blankly at the expensive silk wallpaper completely shattered, entirely broken by her own deceased mother. The terrifying, dangerous syndicate boss menacingly smiled, displaying zero mercy for the deeply pathetic, completely ruined couple sitting directly before him. The masterful execution of my ultimate defensive strategy was flawlessly, beautifully, perfectly complete against my absolute worst desperate enemies tonight. The terrifying syndicate boss violently shook off the residual shock caused by the sudden digital revelation and instantly refocused his cold, predatory gaze. He fiercely slammed his massive, scarred fists onto the polished mahogany table and loudly declared that he absolutely did not care about our miserable, pathetic family drama unfolding before him. He aggressively signaled his heavily armed muscular enforcers, who immediately marched backward and firmly locked the heavy oak doors, trapping everyone inside the luxurious private dining room. The ruthless criminal leader leaned directly across the ruined white tablecloth and menacingly glared into my steady eyes while aggressively demanding his missing millions. He explicitly promised that if I refused to immediately surrender the authentic $30 million property deed right this very second, he would violently extract the massive outstanding debt in absolute pure blood tonight. He boldly threatened to completely dismantle my entire physical existence and systematically destroy every single person occupying this enclosed space until his highly illegal financial demands were fully satisfied. His incredibly violent posturing rapidly escalated the suffocating tension within the dimly lit restaurant, causing both Ebony and Derek to resume their frantic, pathetic weeping from their respective corners. Connor remained completely paralyzed in his plush leather chair, entirely terrified by the sudden deadly escalation orchestrated by the ruthless shadow investors he had foolishly invited. The aggressive mobsters slowly drew their concealed weapons and stood incredibly still, awaiting the final, explicit execution order from their brutal, furious leader. I completely ignored their highly coordinated intimidation tactics and simply adjusted my tailored charcoal gray suit jacket while staring calmly into the violent eyes of the demanding criminal boss. The inescapable reality of extreme physical violence hovered precariously directly above my older, steady head right now, today, forever. I smoothly reached back inside my sleek leather briefcase and casually retrieved the thick stack of highly specialized legal documents finalized deep inside the subterranean banking vault. I completely ignored the deadly weapons currently aimed directly at my chest and calmly slid the pristine federal paperwork straight across the mahogany table toward the furious syndicate leader. I maintained absolute icy composure while deliberately explaining the incredibly uncompromising, rigid nature surrounding a fully executed, irrevocable federal trust. I clearly articulated that the magnificent Coastal Technology Academy no longer legally belonged to me or any other vulnerable private individual breathing inside this restaurant today. The entire $30 million commercial enterprise was officially completely transferred into a heavily shielded, protected government entity permanently guarded by ironclad national banking regulations. I fiercely instructed the violent mobster to thoroughly read the incredibly complex legal terminology, explicitly preventing any private citizen criminal organization or municipal judge from ever accessing those secured assets. The rigid, irrevocable designation absolutely guaranteed that my immense wealth could never be legally seized, manipulated, or aggressively extorted to satisfy the miserable gambling debts accumulated by my treacherous son-in-law. I proudly watched the powerful shadow investor slowly lower his aggressive posture as he carefully processed the monumental legal reality staring directly back at him from the crisp white pages. The coastal estate was permanently legally locked inside an impenetrable federal fortress, completely untouchable by his incredibly dangerous violent hands tonight. I confidently asserted that even if he chose to brutally murder me right here inside this private dining room, my death would absolutely never unlock a single solitary dime of the shielded corporate fortune. My brilliant, meticulous legal defense had entirely effectively neutered his immense criminal power and perfectly secured my ultimate permanent financial victory right now, today, forever. I leaned significantly closer toward the bewildered criminal leader and forcefully delivered the absolute most devastating component of my flawless defensive strategy. I coldly informed the entire silent syndicate that any aggressive physical attempt to illegally extort, seize, or violently compromise my protected federal property would immediately trigger a massive automatic government response. The incredibly specific clauses woven deeply within my irrevocable trust explicitly mandated an instant comprehensive federal investigation spearheaded directly by the FBI if any unauthorized corporate interference ever occurred. I deliberately weaponized the overwhelming absolute power of the United States federal government directly against their highly illicit local shadow banking operations tonight. I clearly warned the muscular investors that forcing a violent confrontation over my shielded assets would instantly expose their entire massive underground lending network to incredibly severe federal scrutiny. The ruthless mobsters suddenly realized that quietly intimidating desperate suburban gambling addicts was a remarkably different game than actively provoking a catastrophic legal war against heavily armed federal law enforcement agencies. I firmly guaranteed that touching a single hair on my older head would immediately permanently destroy their highly lucrative criminal empire and send every single investor sitting inside this luxurious room straight into federal prison. The extremely dangerous men nervously exchanged incredibly tense, terrified glances as the horrific realization of their monumental tactical error violently crushed their former arrogant confidence. I had successfully transformed my massive commercial real estate holdings into a highly toxic, radioactive federal trap specifically designed to entirely annihilate their ruthless local mob today. The devastating psychological dominance I flawlessly commanded within the dim private dining room was completely absolute and entirely unbreakable right now. My pristine corporate assets remained brilliantly shielded, while my treacherous enemies desperately suffocated beneath the crushing weight of their own catastrophic, terrifying tactical failures right here tonight. The imposing syndicate boss slowly picked up the pristine federal trust paperwork and meticulously read through the extremely dense legal terminology explicitly detailing his absolute defeat. He systematically analyzed the incredibly complex corporate clauses and rapidly comprehended the sheer flawless brilliance of my impenetrable defensive maneuvers. He physically felt the staggering weight of the terrifying federal shield I had successfully erected around my massive coastal fortune and immediately understood he had been completely outplayed by a supposedly frail old man. The ruthless criminal leader roughly dropped the heavy legal papers straight back onto the ruined mahogany table and quietly expelled a long, deep breath of pure, absolute resignation. He raised his massive, scarred hand into the dimly lit air and firmly signaled his heavily armed muscular enforcers to immediately completely step back away from my plush leather chair. The extremely aggressive mobsters flawlessly obeyed their silent command and rapidly holstered their concealed weapons while physically retreating toward the locked heavy oak doors. The syndicate boss instantly severed his hostile focus away from my entirely untouchable existence and slowly turned his completely deadly, undivided attention directly onto the pathetic, trembling man shrinking nearby. The violent, terrifying atmosphere inside the luxurious private dining room rapidly shifted violently back toward the original desperate target of their massive, uncollected offshore gambling debt. Connor violently choked on his own frantic breathing as the incredibly ruthless criminal predator officially locked onto his miserable, exposed soul tonight. The horrific realization of his monumental impending destruction physically crushed the deeply treacherous son-in-law against the expensive silk wallpaper right now. I calmly sat back within my comfortable seat and proudly watched the extremely dangerous Shadow Empire finally prepare to violently extract their incredibly bloody repayment directly from his miserable, entirely unprotected flesh starting right here today. Connor violently shoved his heavy leather chair backward as the absolute terrifying reality of his immediate physical danger finally penetrated his thick skull. He desperately scrambled away from the polished mahogany table and wildly sprinted toward the locked oak doors, hoping to blindly escape the deadly syndicate enforcers. His panicked designer shoes slipped awkwardly across the smooth marble floor, completely shattering his carefully manufactured illusion of pristine corporate dominance. The muscular shadow investors reacted with stunning, lethal precision and instantly intercepted his cowardly retreat before he could even reach the brass handles. A massive, scarred enforcer aggressively lunged forward and grabbed Connor violently by the expensive collar of his ruined tailored jacket. The brutal mobster fiercely lifted the screaming coward entirely off the restaurant floor and viciously slammed his pale, sweating face directly against the solid mahogany wall. The sickening thud of the violent physical impact sharply echoed throughout the luxurious private dining room, instantly silencing any remaining whispers of defiance. Connor frantically gasped for air, while desperately kicking his suspended legs, attempting to break free from the crushing iron grip suffocating his throat. He wildly turned his bleeding face toward the long dining table and loudly screamed for his beautiful wife to immediately rescue him from this horrific execution. He pathetically begged Ebony to blindly throw her own fragile body between his trembling frame and the extremely dangerous criminals actively crushing his windpipe. Ebony remained completely frozen inside her plush seating arrangement, absolutely refusing to move a single solitary inch to save her treacherous husband today. She stared blankly at the pathetic, whimpering liar pinned helplessly against the expensive wood, completely abandoning him to the exact same violent fate he had maliciously orchestrated for my vast corporate empire tonight. She coldly realized her perfect suburban life was absolutely destroyed. Flashing blue and red emergency lights suddenly reflected brightly through the massive restaurant windows, instantly illuminating the absolute pure panic rapidly escalating inside the private dining room. The incredibly sharp, vibrant colors aggressively painted the dark silk wallpaper, with terrifying rhythmic flashes, confirming that severe external consequences had finally violently arrived. The heavy oak doors abruptly burst wide open, shattering the highly tense enclosed atmosphere as an overwhelming, massive, authoritative presence fiercely flooded the luxurious space. Evelyn walked confidently directly into the dim, private dining area, radiating an incredibly powerful, brilliant aura of unyielding, absolute legal righteousness tonight. She completely ignored the brutal syndicate mobsters holding my pathetic son-in-law hostage and deliberately advanced straight toward the shattered luxury pen resting upon the ruined mahogany table. My brilliant legal counsel was flanked tightly by 4 heavily armed financial crimes detectives wearing incredibly sturdy tactical gear and carrying highly visible loaded weapons. The elite undercover task force instantly fanned out across the expensive marble floor, effectively completely securing every single dark corner of the terrified room with flawless military precision. The aggressive syndicate boss slowly lowered his heavy defensive stance while carefully analyzing the incredibly dangerous, heavily armed federal squad currently surrounding his violent underground crew. Connor openly wept upon seeing the incredibly fierce tactical detectives, hoping their sudden dramatic appearance would miraculously save his miserable neck from the immediate brutal mob execution. He completely failed to understand that Evelyn had intentionally mobilized this incredibly powerful federal strike force specifically to permanently destroy his entire pathetic existence forever today. The flashing, vibrant emergency lights continued projecting bright, violent colors across his bleeding face, illuminating the final tragic moments of his utterly ruined, fraudulent white-collar lifestyle right now. The ultimate trap had finally flawlessly closed tight around his shattered world. The heavily armed financial crimes detectives aggressively seized Connor violently, pinning his trembling body against the polished mahogany table without a single shred of professional hesitation. The lead federal investigator loudly arrested the pathetic, weeping man, officially charging him with massive, systematic wire fraud, blatant document forgery, and horrific attempted elder abuse right here today. Evelyn stood perfectly straight, meticulously handing the lead tactical detective the thick encrypted banking dossier containing absolutely every single piece of irrefutable incriminating evidence required for a permanent lifetime conviction. The violent syndicate investors immediately recognized the incredibly disastrous legal situation and brilliantly chose to completely avoid a massive violent shootout with heavily armed federal law enforcement agents tonight. The ruthless criminal boss smoothly raised his scarred hands, showing absolute total surrender, while silently instructing his massive muscular enforcers to slowly, quietly retreat toward the secondary restaurant exit. The incredibly dangerous shadow mobsters seamlessly blended entirely into the chaotic restaurant background, leaving the completely doomed son-in-law behind to helplessly face his catastrophic federal charges entirely alone. The brutal syndicate leader paused incredibly briefly right behind Connor's trembling shoulder and leaned perfectly close to his bleeding, violently bruised ear before officially disappearing into the cold night. He quietly whispered a remarkably chilling, sinister promise, explicitly guaranteeing that his incredibly violent criminal organization would absolutely be patiently waiting for him directly inside the fortified federal prison walls. Connor released a terrifying, guttural scream of pure, absolute despair, knowing his miserable, fraudulent existence was completely destroyed forever. He vividly understood the ruthless shadow syndicate would mercilessly torture him relentlessly behind those cold iron bars without any possibility of a safe, peaceful escape. His pristine white-collar fantasies were totally annihilated by my flawless legal vengeance perfectly executed here tonight. My brilliant corporate maneuvers eliminated his threat. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked incredibly sharply around Connor's violently trembling wrists, sealing his absolute permanent destruction right here inside the luxurious restaurant. His former towering corporate arrogance was entirely replaced by an incredibly pathetic, whimpering terror as the stern financial detectives roughly pulled him securely onto his shaking legs. He sobbed uncontrollably while the highly trained federal agents systematically marched him straight toward the flashing emergency lights, completely illuminating his incredibly bleak, catastrophic future. The massive, beautiful dining room rapidly emptied, leaving the pristine mahogany table entirely covered with utterly useless fraudulent deeds, violently snapped luxury pens, and completely shattered suburban illusions. I stood flawlessly straight near the expensive silk wallpaper and calmly watched the brutal but highly justified arrest unfold, without displaying a single solitary flicker of paternal emotion today. My perfectly steady heartbeat remained incredibly calm while witnessing the absolute total annihilation of the incredibly treacherous man who foolishly attempted to completely usurp my magnificent protected empire. The primary toxic threat desperately hovering over my vast coastal estate and massive personal wealth was now successfully permanently neutralized forever by my own unwavering defensive brilliance. Evelyn quietly retrieved her thick, encrypted legal dossiers from the ruined table and offered me a remarkably warm, deeply respectful smile of absolute triumphant corporate victory tonight. We confidently exited the dim private room together, leaving my incredibly treacherous, ungrateful daughter weeping hopelessly entirely alone inside the beautifully shattered darkness. I walked proudly into the brisk coastal night air, feeling an incredibly profound, powerful surge of absolute righteous clarity, completely washing entirely over my older, victorious soul. The invisible financial traps had flawlessly executed their lethal purpose, permanently securing my magnificent, unyielding legacy, absolutely, completely, forever, right now, perfectly today, perfectly successfully, undeniably tonight, for the rest of my absolutely brilliant, beautiful life. Ebony stood completely paralyzed beside the ruined mahogany table while watching the heavily armed federal detectives violently drag her treacherous husband directly out of the luxurious private dining room. The intense flashing emergency light slowly faded into the dark coastal night, signifying the absolute permanent end of her perfectly manufactured suburban fantasy. She physically trembled as the horrifying reality of her immense catastrophic financial ruin rapidly settled heavily upon her fragile shoulders tonight. Connor had secretly meticulously drained every single dollar from their joint checking accounts and maliciously liquidated her future children's sacred college funds simply to desperately feed his pathetic, degenerate gambling addiction. He had successfully transformed her pristine, wealthy lifestyle into an inescapable, terrifying prison entirely constructed from massive offshore debts and countless shattered promises. She slowly turned her tear-stained face toward my imposing physical presence and frantically dropped straight down onto her shaking knees right there on the cold marble floor. She desperately grabbed the perfectly tailored fabric of my expensive charcoal gray trousers while loudly weeping uncontrollably before my completely unsympathetic eyes. She pathetically begged me to instantly unlock my heavily shielded federal trust account and mercifully allow her to immediately move back into the safety of my expansive city home today. She loudly whined that her deceitful criminal husband had cowardly left her with absolutely nothing but massive toxic liabilities and an utterly destroyed public reputation. She frantically promised to completely change her incredibly toxic, entitled behavior and loudly swore she would magically become the perfectly loving, devoted daughter I had always rightfully deserved. She desperately pleaded for unconditional paternal salvation from the horrific, violent nightmare she had blindly helped orchestrate against my own grieving life. I stared coldly downward at the miserable, weeping woman gripping my trousers and felt absolutely zero remaining fatherly compassion. I smoothly stepped entirely away from her desperate, grasping fingers and coldly denied her pathetic request for immediate financial sanctuary within my heavily protected private residence. I calmly explained that my magnificent city home was now permanently locked away inside an impenetrable, irrevocable federal trust account explicitly designed to aggressively deflect entitled parasites just like her today. I flawlessly signaled DeAndre, who stepped quietly from the restaurant shadows and firmly placed a remarkably cheap, scuffed canvas suitcase directly onto the polished marble floor beside her trembling knees. I stared directly down into her terrified, tearful eyes and explicitly informed her that this exceptionally ugly bag contained absolutely everything she currently rightfully owned in this entire miserable world. I had proactively instructed my highly efficient property manager to systematically pack her most basic, unremarkable daily clothing and thoroughly discard every single luxury designer item purchased with maliciously stolen capital. I fiercely reminded my weeping daughter that she had deliberately actively chosen to treat her own grieving father like a completely useless, disposable financial burden simply occupying excess physical space. She had maliciously supported a violently treacherous plot to permanently institutionalize me behind cold, sterile walls just to rapidly accelerate her personal greedy inheritance timeline tonight. I loudly proclaimed that I was officially permanently relieving her of that supposedly heavy paternal burden right here inside this ruined private dining room completely forever. She was now absolutely entirely free to navigate her incredibly dangerous, violent new reality, completely devoid of my massive, impenetrable corporate shield or unconditional financial protection. She stared utterly horrified at the cheap, frayed luggage, realizing her incredibly profound arrogance had ultimately cost her the absolute greatest loyal protector she would ever possibly finally know during her entire completely shattered, incredibly pathetic, completely ruined, miserable little life right now today. Derek slowly peeled his sweating, trembling body away from the dark, shadowy corner and aggressively stumbled forward across the expensive marble floor toward my immaculate, imposing figure. He frantically wiped the streaming, panicked tears from his terrified eyes and loudly begged to know exactly what he was supposed to do about his completely impending, catastrophic personal bankruptcy tonight. He wildly claimed that the ruthless, dangerous syndicate investors would relentlessly, systematically destroy his entire pristine professional reputation and violently seize his beautiful, sprawling suburban estate by tomorrow afternoon. He pathetically pleaded for any possible magical financial guidance to effortlessly, miraculously rescue his deeply privileged, sheltered existence from the absolutely monstrous, crushing consequences of his own monumental, cowardly stupidity. I stared fiercely into his utterly terrified, completely broken eyes and calmly retrieved a remarkably plain, flimsy white business card from my tailored suit jacket pocket. I aggressively shoved the incredibly cheap faded card directly against his profusely sweating chest and explicitly informed him that it belonged to a remarkably inexpensive, highly desperate local bankruptcy attorney. I coldly commanded my utterly ruined son to officially hire this incredibly mediocre legal representation and immediately begin liquidating every single incredibly luxurious asset he currently proudly owned. I loudly advised him to rapidly learn exactly how to violently swing a heavy physical steel hammer, just like his extremely hard-working ancestors had successfully done for countless previous generations. I fiercely stated that he must now forcefully systematically rebuild his completely ruined, miserable, shattered life entirely, from the absolute filthy bottom dirt straight up, without a single solitary drop of my massive shielded corporate wealth. He hopelessly stared at the incredibly cheap plain business card, while profoundly realizing his beautifully manicured privileged existence was now officially, permanently, completely, utterly destroyed forever, starting right here tonight, unconditionally today. I completely turned my broad, tailored back directly against my hysterically weeping children and firmly closed my emotional heart to their endless, pathetic, incredibly desperate apologies tonight. The absolute total destruction of our once beautiful, sacred familial bond was now flawlessly, permanently cemented beyond any conceivable microscopic hope of future miraculous repair today. The deeply treacherous siblings instantly viciously turned their overwhelming, boundless rage directly onto each other, wildly screaming horrifying personal insults while aggressively assigning total, absolute blame for their monumental, catastrophic financial downfall. They behaved exactly like completely rabid, starving animals, hopelessly trapped entirely inside a rapidly collapsing, burning steel cage, desperately fighting over the utterly useless, miserable ashes of their profoundly ruined, fraudulent existence. I calmly walked completely away from the incredibly pathetic, chaotic spectacle unfolding wildly across the ruined, polished mahogany table without expressing a single solitary flicker of paternal regret. Evelyn gracefully stepped firmly directly beside my tall, unyielding physical frame and confidently matched my incredibly steady, powerful marching pace straight toward the wide-open restaurant exit doors. My broad shoulders remained impeccably straight and incredibly proud as I flawlessly, triumphantly navigated directly through the dark, beautiful, luxurious hallway, leaving the devastating, utter madness permanently, entirely behind me. I fiercely, successfully neutralized the incredibly dangerous, toxic, imminent threat to my magnificent coastal property and effectively, permanently secured my entire massive corporate empire forever. I marched boldly, flawlessly forward into the brisk, cold, refreshing coastal night air, feeling an incredibly deep, overwhelming sense of absolute, pure, majestic, righteous vindication thoroughly washing entirely over my completely victorious, triumphant soul today. My ungrateful, treacherous, greedy enemies were now officially entirely left standing, completely, utterly, helplessly, perfectly alone, directly inside the burning, absolute, catastrophic, total ruins of their own monumental, blinding, infinite greed, completely forever, starting right now, today. Exactly 1 month after the devastating confrontation inside the private dining room, I comfortably guided my pristine luxury sedan directly down the familiar winding coastal highway. The morning weather was absolutely magnificent, featuring crisp ocean air and a perfectly clear, bright sky, completely devoid of any lingering dark clouds today. I smoothly navigated the sharp scenic curves while listening to the powerful rhythmic crashing of the massive ocean waves violently striking the ancient rocky shoreline far below my tires. The heavy emotional burden that had previously suffocated my entire existence was entirely eradicated, leaving behind a profoundly peaceful, absolute clarity within my older, revitalized soul. I approached the expansive, beautifully manicured property line marking the official boundary of my monumental technological estate and immediately noticed the striking, beautiful physical upgrades. The pathetic old rusty iron gate that had formerly guarded the secluded entrance was now entirely replaced by a gleaming, massive, highly secure modern steel barricade. This incredibly imposing, impenetrable defensive structure perfectly symbolized the absolute permanent security I had successfully established around my massive corporate empire and my personal peace of mind. The heavily fortified entrance silently, flawlessly glided wide open the absolute second my approaching vehicle triggered the advanced, sophisticated facial recognition scanning protocols installed discreetly within the reinforced stone pillars. I slowly drove my quiet vehicle completely through the magnificent towering gates, leaving the chaotic, treacherous public world permanently behind me. I confidently parked my polished luxury car directly in front of the primary administrative building, feeling an incredibly deep, undeniable sense of absolute, complete, majestic ownership over the sprawling coastal property today. The pristine, beautiful architecture perfectly reflected the absolute, unyielding structural integrity I had forcefully, brutally maintained against the relentless, greedy attacks orchestrated by my completely ruined, incredibly pathetic, treacherous former family entirely today, forever. DeAndre stood proudly directly outside the magnificent glass entrance, completely ready to formally receive my highly anticipated physical arrival this beautiful morning. He immediately offered me an incredibly firm, respectful handshake, silently confirming that our immense, heavily protected commercial facility was currently operating flawlessly, perfectly, under his extremely vigilant daily supervision. The sprawling coastal estate was absolutely thriving with vibrant, positive energy, completely overflowing with boundless, incredible academic activity bursting from every single pristine classroom. I confidently walked directly through the beautifully illuminated, bustling hallways, proudly observing dozens of brilliant young students actively, intensely engaged in highly complex, advanced technological learning. The dedicated professional staff members worked incredibly diligently, constantly providing an absolutely exceptional academic environment entirely free from any toxic, manipulative, external corporate interference today. Every single individual occupying this incredibly beautiful sanctuary moved with profound, purposeful dedication, completely insulated from the horrific, miserable, chaotic greed that had recently aggressively, violently attempted to entirely destroy this sacred foundation. I slowly paused near a massive, beautifully polished glass observation window and physically, vividly witnessed the absolutely true, powerful, incredible, monumental legacy my brilliant late wife Gwendolyn had flawlessly, permanently left entirely behind. She had deliberately, intentionally constructed this magnificent, sprawling sanctuary specifically to beautifully nurture ambitious, brilliant young minds and permanently empower their incredibly bright, completely unlimited future potential. The highly inspiring sight of these deeply focused, dedicated, ambitious students intensely collaborating on sophisticated, advanced projects entirely validated every single incredibly ruthless defensive measure I had successfully, flawlessly, violently executed against my pathetic, treacherous former family recently. Her brilliant, powerful, undeniable visionary dream was now successfully, permanently, unconditionally protected entirely forever by my absolute, unyielding, rigid, corporate ironclad shield, completely successfully guaranteeing her massive, incredibly beautiful structural legacy remains flawlessly, completely secure against any absolutely miserable, greedy predators completely today. I deliberately stepped directly into the magnificent master director's office featuring massive panoramic windows completely overlooking the incredibly vast, beautiful, crashing ocean outside. I slowly, confidently approached the incredibly heavy, polished mahogany desk and comfortably sat entirely down deeply inside the extraordinarily plush, luxurious leather executive chair. The immense physical weight of this supreme structural authority instantly wrapped entirely around my steady, broad shoulders, successfully anchoring my incredibly powerful, absolute corporate dominance. I reached my remarkably steady hand straight forward and gently opened a completely fresh, incredibly pristine blank ledger resting perfectly beautifully upon the smooth wooden surface. I smoothly retrieved an incredibly expensive custom luxury pen, completely ready to flawlessly, systematically record the absolute brilliant, massive, highly lucrative, expanding corporate future, completely unfolding directly ahead. I was absolutely no longer the incredibly broken, utterly exhausted, deeply grieving, miserable, lonely widower, completely drowning within a massive, suffocating ocean of profound personal despair. I had successfully, completely, flawlessly, miraculously resurrected my deeply shattered, vulnerable emotional state entirely from the absolute pitch-black, freezing cold, terrifying ashes of my own massive, personal, monumental tragedy. I am now officially, permanently, the incredibly powerful, absolute, undisputed soul master, completely directing this massive, sprawling, beautiful, coastal, technological corporate empire forever today. I proudly possess the absolute, unwavering, magnificent, flawless, righteous strength specifically required to successfully, brilliantly lead this vast, incredible, brilliant academic institution directly forward into an incredibly bright, highly lucrative, beautifully secure, limitless, majestic corporate future. My treacherous, greedy, miserable, ungrateful, pathetic enemies were entirely, permanently, utterly, flawlessly destroyed forever, leaving my magnificent, pristine legacy absolutely perfectly, beautifully, completely, flawlessly safe. They will absolutely never successfully, violently penetrate my incredibly powerful, magnificent corporate defensive walls or forcefully extract another single, solitary stolen dime from my highly secure, incredibly massive, beautiful, pristine, deeply protected, wealthy coastal empire. Evelyn suddenly called my highly secured private office telephone line, completely disrupting the profound, silent, absolute peace currently washing entirely over my beautifully restored, victorious soul. She calmly, confidently, explicitly informed me that Connor had desperately, cowardly accepted a severely, incredibly harsh plea deal, specifically guaranteeing exactly 7 miserable, agonizing years completely locked directly inside a heavily fortified federal penitentiary. My treacherous former daughter, Ebony, was now absolutely, permanently, completely reduced to brutally, physically exhausting minimum wage labor, forcefully, frantically working long, miserable, pathetic double shifts as a severely, incredibly, completely disrespected local diner waitress. My foolish, completely ruined, arrogant son, Derek, was currently physically laying heavy, incredibly dirty concrete bricks directly for an incredibly ruthless, exceedingly brutal, massive commercial construction crew simply to desperately financially survive his incredibly massive, monumental, crushing, catastrophic personal bankruptcy, the incredibly severe, completely agonizing, incredibly powerful consequences they violently, rapidly brought directly, entirely down, completely upon their incredibly pathetic, miserable own, incredibly greedy, utterly broken, treacherous shoulders were absolutely, entirely, completely, permanently, unconditionally, strictly, brutally enforced by an absolutely unforgiving, incredibly, highly rigid, utterly flawless, permanent, completely unyielding, completely merciless legal justice system today. I proudly, successfully maintained absolute zero internal paternal remorse perfectly, knowing they had willingly, viciously, actively, maliciously, ruthlessly, plotted to violently, mercilessly, permanently, entirely, rob my beloved late wife, Gwendolyn, completely blind. I proudly, smoothly disconnected the secure office phone entirely, placing the sleek black receiver deliberately, gently, perfectly, directly, straight down, directly, entirely upon the beautifully polished, wide, immaculate, pristine, heavy mahogany desk surface. I leaned comfortably deep backward into my extraordinarily, incredibly plush, luxury executive chair. Entirely, completely, peacefully, closing my tired, older, wise, incredibly deeply satisfied, profoundly triumphant, victorious eyes, while fully, successfully, flawlessly, perfectly, permanently, unconditionally, firmly securing my incredibly vast, magnificent, beautiful, pristine legacy forever. A heavily dented, rusted vehicle slowly approached the gleaming modern security gates of my magnificent coastal technological retreat under the bright afternoon sun. The sputtering engine loudly coughed as the incredibly beat-up car sputtered to a complete halt directly before the highly fortified entrance. The heavily reinforced steel barricade smoothly retracted after my dedicated security personnel visually identified the absolutely exhausted driver gripping the steering wheel. Derek slowly drove his pathetic, incredibly damaged sedan onto the pristine, manicured grounds and awkwardly parked near the beautiful administrative building. He completely lacked the arrogant, pristine corporate swagger he had once so obnoxiously paraded around my expensive properties. My deeply humbled son slowly stepped out of the noisy, ruined vehicle wearing severely stained, incredibly dirty construction clothes covered entirely in gray concrete dust. His formerly soft, manicured fingers were now completely wrapped in thick, heavy bandages and terribly covered in deep, incredibly brutal physical calluses resulting from incredibly harsh manual labor. He physically looked entirely exhausted, completely broken down by the exceptionally punishing reality of his monumental, catastrophic bankruptcy. He slowly dragged his heavy steel toe work boots across the smooth paved walkway and humbly approached the main glass doors with profound, genuine hesitation. He absolutely did not march inside loudly, demanding an immediate, massive financial bailout from my heavily protected federal trust account today. He completely bypassed the reception desk and quietly, humbly asked the vigilant security guards for exactly 5 brief minutes of my valuable professional time. He respectfully submitted to their thorough security protocols without expressing a single solitary complaint or projecting his former incredibly toxic, entitled suburban attitude. I watched his completely broken, incredibly dirty physical form carefully through my massive panoramic office window and calmly instructed DeAndre to safely escort him directly upward into my private sanctuary. Derek slowly walked directly into my massive, expansive coastal office and quietly sat straight down across the incredibly pristine, polished mahogany desk. He looked entirely, incredibly different from the highly arrogant, utterly ungrateful, incredibly selfish, completely treacherous corporate monster I had violently, effectively banished completely forever exactly 1 turbulent month ago. He absolutely did not loudly complain about his severely painful, incredibly blistering physical labor, or desperately beg for a massive, miraculous financial intervention to instantly, completely, magically erase his incredibly monumental, catastrophic bankruptcy today. He slowly placed his severely, heavily calloused, physically bleeding hands incredibly gently upon his dirty, completely ruined denim jeans and maintained absolute, perfectly steady, unbroken eye contact with my deeply calculating, older gaze. He incredibly humbly offered a profoundly, deeply genuine, remarkably sincere emotional apology that completely lacked any miserable, pathetic, entitled suburban excuses or cowardly shifting of tremendous personal blame. He firmly, explicitly stated that he was absolutely, entirely, completely sorry for viciously, actively choosing to behave like a miserable, spineless, incredibly weak, absolute, complete coward when his own grieving father desperately, vitally needed his absolute, unconditional defensive protection the most. He loudly, completely, explicitly, firmly, undeniably took absolute, pure, unmitigated, personal, physical, emotional, absolute responsibility for his incredibly monumental, catastrophic, massive, treacherous, unforgivable, familial betrayal. He heavily admitted that his incredibly foolish, highly toxic, blind, corporate, greedy arrogance had completely, entirely, horribly, permanently blinded his incredibly weak, ungrateful, extremely pathetic soul to the absolute, pure, devastating, horrific reality surrounding his incredibly dangerous, incredibly treacherous, highly deceitful brother-in-law. He loudly, solemnly, completely swore that he would perfectly, entirely, humbly accept his incredibly severe, extremely harsh, physically brutal, highly agonizing manual labor as a completely just deeply righteous, incredibly profoundly necessary, permanent, daily, absolute, physical, emotional, completely undeniable, perfect penance entirely, unconditionally today. I calmly maintained my firm, steady posture while silently absorbing his incredibly sincere, genuine emotional confession right here today. I absolutely did not miraculously offer him a highly lucrative, extremely comfortable executive corporate job, perfectly safely secured directly inside my vast, magnificent, heavily shielded coastal facility tonight. I completely, entirely refused to instantly, miraculously solve his incredibly complex, monumental, devastating financial disaster, or magically, forcefully, instantly remove the incredibly, exceptionally agonizing, heavy, brutal, physical labor currently physically destroying his severely blistered, heavily calloused, tired hands. I intentionally, firmly, decisively, explicitly offered my severely humbled son something incredibly, massively, profoundly, significantly, remarkably, tremendously, far exponentially, absolutely, incredibly, unyieldingly, completely, exceptionally, more completely, fundamentally, entirely, inherently, practically, essentially valuable today. I freely offered him my absolute, pure, completely flawless, incredibly, deeply, exceptionally, unconditional, unwavering, massive, undeniably true, profound, complete, unbreakable, immense, permanent, total, absolute respect. I loudly, proudly, clearly, strongly, incredibly, firmly, definitively stated that absolute, pure, magnificent, indestructible, flawless, undeniable, personal, formidable, true character, strength is actively, brutally, physically, meticulously, exceptionally, painfully, beautifully, strictly, perfectly, reliably, permanently built, completely, entirely inside the absolute pitch black, completely terrifying, utterly freezing, incredibly lonely, miserable, unforgiving, incredibly exhausting, cold, incredibly miserable, deeply isolating, horrible dark. I clearly, completely, proudly, explicitly, firmly confirm that, by humbly, flawlessly, actively, bravely, consistently, remarkably, silently, completely enduring this incredibly, severely, remarkably, deeply, intensely, exceptionally, remarkably, unbelievably, physically agonizing, absolutely painful, extremely torturous, incredibly backbreaking physical manual labor. He was finally, officially, actively, bravely, undeniably, successfully, forcefully, safely, gracefully, miraculously, purposefully, strongly, fundamentally, fully, physically, actively, powerfully, continuously walking completely, directly, squarely, totally, undeniably, firmly, safely, right upon the righteous, correct, perfectly true, absolutely, entirely flawless, right? Glorious redemption, salvation, permanent, perfectly secure, safe, beautiful, magnificent, undeniably successful, true path today, completely, perfectly, forever, right? Exactly, beautifully now. Derek respectfully stood completely straight up from the plush leather chair, maintaining his remarkably renewed, absolute, unbreakable physical posture tonight. He quietly offered me one final, deeply profound, incredibly respectful, genuine, loving, gentle nod, flawlessly communicating his massive, absolute, total understanding. He calmly, completely, smoothly, flawlessly, gracefully, silently, beautifully, effortlessly, quietly, peacefully, permanently, confidently, deliberately turned his broad, muscular, transformed shoulders entirely perfectly away from my polished mahogany desk today. He began walking proudly straight across the massive, immaculate, pristine, glossy coastal office floor, entirely wrapped tightly in his severely ruined, stained, remarkably cheap, dirty work clothes. He walked incredibly, significantly, flawlessly, remarkably, exponentially, completely, utterly, more incredibly proudly, significantly, massively, deeply, powerfully, majestically, perfectly taller in those incredibly, extremely worn, severely, absolutely filthy, battered, incredibly heavy, thick steel toe, incredibly cheap, dirty boots right now today than he ever, absolutely, incredibly, previously, undeniably did, while obnoxiously, proudly, carelessly, casually, effortlessly, constantly, entirely, arrogantly parading, actively, perfectly, flawlessly, loudly, wildly, completely, foolishly, successfully, safely, gracefully, perfectly, carelessly, arrogantly, entirely, safely, carelessly, blindly, wearing those incredibly, outrageously, immensely, obscenely, extremely, ridiculously, vastly, exceptionally, severely, utterly expensive, immaculate, incredibly pristine, perfectly, wonderfully, correctly, fully custom, exceptionally, highly, beautifully, perfectly, completely, meticulously, accurately, flawlessly, luxurious, perfectly beautiful, completely flawless designer suits. I peacefully, quietly, calmly, softly, proudly, strongly, gracefully, lovingly, successfully, totally, completely, flawlessly, firmly stood entirely, completely, peacefully, absolutely, beautifully, perfectly, directly, strongly, totally, flawlessly, exactly, correctly, entirely correctly, directly, straight, successfully, incredibly smoothly, right? Perfectly, completely beside my massive, gorgeous, pristine, beautiful, panoramic, spotless, perfectly clean, incredibly clear, perfectly gorgeous, beautifully flawless, beautiful, completely perfect office window. I successfully watched my son gracefully, strongly, carefully drive, perfectly, successfully, safely, completely, totally, peacefully, gracefully, entirely, flawlessly, securely, safely, securely, wonderfully, safely, entirely, completely, incredibly, deeply, successfully, safely away, perfectly, flawlessly today, forever, flawlessly. A remarkably thick cream-colored envelope arrived securely at the heavily fortified coastal facility, entirely lacking any formal return address today. Ebony possessed absolutely zero courage to physically visit my imposing technological sanctuary in person after her monumentally catastrophic public downfall. She deliberately chose to send a deeply personal handwritten letter meticulously detailing the incredibly harsh, unforgiving reality surrounding her completely impoverished new existence. Her elegant cursive handwriting violently trembled across the heavy paper, beautifully documenting the severe, agonizing consequences she gracefully endured daily. She explicitly described the absolute, profound daily humiliation of physically serving hot, cheap coffee directly to the exact same wealthy elite socialites she previously arrogantly hosted at lavish suburban dinner parties. She vividly painted an incredibly bleak, depressing picture outlining exactly how those exceptionally cruel former friends thoroughly enjoyed maliciously mocking her ruined financial state while aggressively demanding constant endless refills. Her tired, blistering hands constantly ached from aggressively scrubbing incredibly filthy restaurant tables, completely replacing her perfectly manicured, luxurious, pristine past. She explicitly stated that surviving entirely upon a remarkably tiny minimum wage salary forcibly stripped away every single pathetic layer of her previously boundless, toxic arrogance. She quietly endured incredibly exhausting, brutal double shifts simply to successfully pay her overdue utility bills without ever requesting a single solitary dime from my perfectly shielded offshore federal accounts today. The incredibly raw, agonizing truth beautifully bled straight through the blue ink, perfectly illustrating her massive, undeniably profound psychological transformation, separating her entirely from her highly toxic, severely fraudulent previous suburban identity. Her deeply sincere emotional honesty vividly showcased her highly agonizing, incredibly painful, daily, physical, total, grueling, continuous, exceptionally exhausting, incredibly miserable, endless, complete struggle, flawlessly, beautifully, honestly, today, right now, undeniably, firmly, correctly, totally, perfectly, accurately, forever in this exact, specific, precise, lonely, cold moment. She incredibly openly admitted that her treacherous husband Connor was an absolutely destructive, ruthless financial parasite, constantly, actively draining their wealthy, pristine suburban household without a single solitary drop of genuine remorse. She explicitly accepted absolute, pure, unmitigated personal blame, explicitly stating she deliberately acted like his entirely willing, completely submissive, accommodating, naive host. She acknowledged that she intentionally, blindly, silently allowed his highly toxic, incredibly dangerous, deeply miserable parasitic behavior to brutally, continuously, actively feed directly off her own beautiful, immaculate, protected family completely effortlessly for several incredibly long, exceptionally painful, incredibly dark years. She fiercely, vividly, boldly, undeniably recognized exactly how my incredibly, remarkably, exceptionally, overwhelmingly, terrifyingly, unexpectedly ruthless, decisive corporate defensive action, ultimately, perfectly, miraculously, flawlessly, fundamentally, successfully, gracefully saved her incredibly pathetic, entirely miserable, exceptionally flawed, severely broken, desperately hopeless, pathetic delusion, forever. She explicitly, clearly, loudly proclaimed that my exceptionally beautiful, perfectly executed, highly severe, absolute corporate vengeance, physically, fundamentally, completely, forcibly ripped. The incredibly heavy, massive, terrifying, exceptionally dark, suffocating, toxic, exceptionally thick blindfold, directly straight, entirely away off her, incredibly foolish, exceptionally highly blind, utterly, perfectly, entirely, completely naive, terribly, severely, utterly weeping, completely, flawlessly beautiful eyes. She completely confirmed exactly how this extremely brutal, extraordinarily agonizing, physically punishing, absolute total financial ruination was absolutely, genuinely, undeniably the incredibly best, specific, single, possible, perfect thing that could have beautifully, miraculously, magically, flawlessly, fundamentally, successfully, effectively, gracefully, successfully, permanently, decisively, completely saved her incredibly broken, shattered, miserable life directly today, right, exactly now, forever. She realized that maintaining absolute, pure, zero, constant contact with her incredibly dark, deeply miserable, shattered, toxic, manipulative, incredibly deceitful, horrible past was absolutely, completely, undeniably, mathematically, exactly, entirely, completely, flawlessly, successfully, unconditionally, magically, permanently, incredibly, profoundly, highly definitively, entirely required to completely, beautifully, effectively, accurately heal perfectly today, forever. I slowly, meticulously read through every single highly emotional, tear-stained, incredibly desperate handwritten sentence, carefully absorbing her absolute, massive, undeniably profound personal transformation completely alone inside my massive office. I absolutely firmly refused to immediately draft a remarkably long, emotionally comforting, flawlessly reassuring, beautiful, personal, swift, immediate reply right now. I deliberately, gently, meticulously, perfectly smoothly, accurately folded the thick, heavy, cream-colored stationery perfectly neatly, completely correctly, back together with absolute, pure, flawless, meticulous, precise, smooth precision tonight. I silently, perfectly, calmly, carefully locked the incredibly emotionally heavy, beautiful letter permanently away inside my heavily armored, highly secure, solid, pristine, expensive, thick, beautifully solid, heavy, pure, flawless, steel-bottom desk drawer, completely forever. I explicitly, firmly, deeply understood that undeniably pure, flawlessly brilliant, fully authentic, miraculously complete, incredibly true, massive, fundamental healing absolutely requires an incredibly, completely, massively, highly exceptional, perfectly huge, beautifully profound, exceptionally significant, incredibly, perfectly, remarkably exceptional amount of exceptionally, painfully, deeply slow, completely unyielding, exactly, totally, precisely, absolutely flawless, beautifully significant time today, completely, forever, completely. I absolutely, flawlessly, unconditionally, completely, beautifully, entirely, perfectly, utterly, thoroughly, entirely, firmly refused to incorrectly, falsely, forcefully, aggressively, artificially, rapidly, miraculously, effortlessly, magically, completely, dangerously rush the absolutely, purely, explicitly, undeniably, completely, flawlessly, perfectly, incredibly, exceptionally, significantly, profoundly, immensely, completely, incredibly, entirely, uniquely necessary, incredibly, totally, absolutely, perfectly, painfully, exactly, heavily, strictly, purely, completely, flawlessly essential process of her incredibly new, entirely, completely fresh, incredibly beautiful, exceptionally, utterly amazing, perfectly, undeniably, incredibly flawless, utterly, incredibly, beautifully, remarkably absolute, newly, profoundly, significantly, incredibly complete, beautiful, pure, incredibly absolute, profound, remarkably complete, total, absolute, pure, flawless, magnificent, complete, permanent, incredibly gorgeous, beautifully, completely, flawlessly, miraculously, perfectly, entirely, wonderfully, purely, exceptionally, incredibly true. Maturity exactly today, perfectly, wonderfully, safely, flawlessly, correctly, perfectly, directly, totally correctly, completely right, exactly, flawlessly, correctly now. I confidently reached across the pristine, polished mahogany desk in my expansive coastal office to retrieve my favorite fountain pen. I decisively signed a monumental, multi-million-dollar corporate expansion deal specifically designed to instantly double the operational housing capacity of our magnificent technological retreat. This massive financial investment will absolutely guarantee that hundreds of incredibly brilliant but severely underprivileged youth will receive an unparalleled world-class academic education completely free of any tuition costs. I actively channeled every single ounce of my incredibly formidable personal energy and vast corporate resources entirely toward building a significantly brighter, deeply prosperous future for these highly deserving, innocent students. I enthusiastically poured my immense, undeniable wealth directly into absolute pure creation and magnificent, constant, steady, progressive technological advancement today. The incredibly, horribly dark, miserable, agonizing, treacherous destruction, maliciously orchestrated by my exceptionally ungrateful, incredibly toxic former family, was now permanently, forcefully, deliberately, definitively, successfully, completely left, incredibly, extremely, profoundly far behind me. My exceptionally magnificent, absolutely beautiful, pristine, unyielding, incredibly brilliant legacy was now entirely, flawlessly, firmly, miraculously, totally, perfectly, wonderfully, peacefully, happily, explicitly, successfully, perfectly, efficiently, permanently, securely, fully, permanently, perfectly, flawlessly protected forever. Gwendolyn's absolutely magnificent, powerful, incredible, undeniably visionary, brilliant, exceptionally beautiful, selfless, inspiring dream will permanently continue to dramatically, powerfully, positively transform countless incredibly young, vulnerable, deeply ambitious, exceptionally hopeful, extremely smart, incredibly bright, beautiful lives, perfectly, smoothly, flawlessly, beautifully, constantly, wonderfully, forever. I calmly stood up from my exceptionally luxurious, comfortable, incredibly plush, pristine, beautiful, heavy, incredibly thick, exceptionally soft, perfect, incredibly beautiful, heavy, magnificent leather chair and walked exceptionally proudly, directly, completely, explicitly, wonderfully, beautifully, strongly, straight, perfectly, incredibly, flawlessly, cleanly, effectively, safely, deliberately, happily, exactly, gracefully, actively, exactly, permanently, precisely, gracefully, enthusiastically, fully, beautifully, toward the incredibly bright, wonderfully sunny, totally pristine, incredibly clear, successful future. Winter officially arrived at the magnificent coastal beach, bringing a remarkably sharp, biting chill that swept fiercely across the darkening oceanic horizon. Warwick walked entirely alone along the freezing, sweeping shoreline, wearing a heavy wool coat tightly secured against the immensely powerful, freezing coastal winds. He deliberately paced his steady footsteps against the wet-packed sand while deeply, profoundly reflecting upon the absolute, sheer, monumental chaos defining his incredibly turbulent past year. The relentlessly crashing gray waves perfectly mirrored the incredible violent turbulence he had successfully navigated and flawlessly survived since the tragic passing of his beloved wife. He meticulously analyzed the incredibly difficult, profound transition from being a supposedly weak, vulnerable, grieving victim into an absolutely undisputed, triumphant corporate victor. This incredibly massive personal transformation was definitively born out of absolute, pure, undeniable necessity, rather than any simple, fleeting feelings of petty malice or hollow personal revenge. He vividly understood that his incredibly harsh defensive actions were entirely mandatory to successfully protect his magnificent legacy from complete, absolute, total destruction at the greedy hands of his incredibly treacherous, ungrateful family. He had absolutely never actively sought to brutally ruin his foolish children or permanently incarcerate his highly deceitful son-in-law, but their own exceptionally toxic, monumental greed forced his unyielding righteous hand. He completely recognized that establishing an impenetrable federal fortress was the absolute only viable solution to permanently eradicate the massive, dangerous criminal threat deliberately invited into his formerly peaceful life. The freezing ocean breeze severely whipped against his remarkably calm older face, serving as a beautifully harsh, continuous physical reminder of the incredibly brutal emotional storms he had beautifully, flawlessly, entirely conquered. He stood perfectly still, facing the vast, freezing, turbulent water, knowing absolutely flawlessly that his immensely difficult actions were utterly, unequivocally necessary forever, perfectly today. He thought constantly, deeply, beautifully, affectionately about his late, brilliant, magnificent wife Gwendolyn while steadily walking alongside the absolutely freezing, incredibly vast, gray, beautiful ocean tonight. He finally, perfectly, thoroughly understood exactly why she had deliberately, proactively, entirely kept the incredibly massive financial corporate secret completely away from their incredibly treacherous, foolish, exceptionally greedy suburban children. She possessed an incredibly profound, remarkable, intuitive psychological wisdom, perfectly understanding that distributing massive, unearned, vast monetary wealth completely without installing proper grounding, absolute moral wisdom, is an absolutely devastating, inherently fatal, permanent, terrible curse. She brilliantly, flawlessly, correctly deduced that instantly handing their deeply flawed, incredibly weak, intensely arrogant, miserable, utterly pathetic children completely unrestricted, limitless corporate access would only forcefully, exponentially, actively, incredibly, aggressively, violently, rapidly accelerate their own total, absolute, terrifying, inevitable physical, psychological, completely devastating personal destruction. She profoundly trusted Warwick implicitly, unconditionally, completely, fully, absolutely, seamlessly, entirely, flawlessly, deeply, passionately, beautifully, heavily, eternally, constantly, actively, undeniably, forever, to physically, brilliantly, incredibly, effectively, decisively, flawlessly, beautifully, successfully, powerfully, miraculously, wonderfully handle this massive, dark, terrifying, dangerous corporate curse. Whenever the terrible, dreadful, inevitable, tragic time finally, ultimately, truly, tragically, actively, actually, eventually, unavoidably, permanently, sadly, undeniably, unfortunately arrived. He beautifully, flawlessly, fully, correctly honored her deeply, sacred, highly protected, absolute, completely unbreakable, profound, incredibly powerful, beautiful, eternal, loving, final, magnificent, defensive wish. The profound memory of her brilliant mind filled his steady, older beating heart with an incredibly deep, pure, absolute, flawless warmth, completely validating his incredibly complex decisions forever. She was absolutely entirely right about absolutely everything she had secretly, flawlessly planned for their massive corporate empire to survive. The toxic greed of their miserable, broken children perfectly today, forever. Completely, permanently, safely, beautifully right, exactly, purely, happily, comfortably, wonderfully, joyfully, peacefully, utterly, successfully, strictly, wonderfully, safely, explicitly, permanently, securely now. Warwick slowly bent his stiff, older knees directly toward the wet, icy sand and incredibly gently picked up a perfectly smooth, wonderfully round, dark gray stone, currently resting perfectly beautifully upon the heavily frosted, incredibly freezing, beautiful shoreline. He calmly, effortlessly, flawlessly, smoothly, physically skipped the wonderfully polished, heavy gray rock directly straight entirely across the exceptionally dark, immensely freezing, turbulent coastal water today. The remarkably beautiful skipping stone flawlessly bounced incredibly smoothly, rapidly, powerfully, directly across the violently crashing frozen waves, perfectly, beautifully, entirely silently, vanishing entirely forever straight into the undeniably exceptionally massive, endless, oceanic, dark, beautiful, pitch-black depth. He incredibly, profoundly, intimately, physically felt the remarkably massive, exceptionally tremendous, highly unavoidable, perfectly natural, exceptionally extreme, heavy, brutal, agonizing, weary weight of his increasingly advanced older physical age, deeply radiating entirely, completely, strongly, directly throughout his incredibly, exceptionally, physically tired human bones. Yet simultaneously he brilliantly, successfully, powerfully, flawlessly, intensely, profoundly, deeply, intensely, absolutely experienced the immensely, perfectly, entirely beautiful, utterly, profoundly, completely, exceptionally unparalleled, magnificent, beautiful, sweet, incredibly pure, utterly magical, perfect, glorious, absolute lightness of absolute, complete, magnificent, perfect, total, emotional freedom, completely washing, entirely, completely, perfectly, gracefully, smoothly, incredibly, incredibly, wonderfully, softly over him. The remarkably deeply, exceptionally complex, incredibly dangerous, physically punishing, intensely stressful, extremely volatile, completely toxic, undeniably, beautifully, successfully, meticulously engineered, remarkably powerful, perfectly brilliant, completely flawless, utterly flawlessly executed, completely beautiful, incredibly profound, undeniably masterful, absolutely perfect, completely brilliant, flawless, silent adjustment was officially perfectly, definitively complete. The predators were now absolutely either permanently locked away inside cold, unforgiving, harsh, sterile, fortified federal cages, or forcefully, actively, miraculously reformed by extremely grueling, heavy, punishing, severe, remarkably hard, agonizing, brutal, exceptionally, incredibly, intensely exhausting manual labor. Today, perfectly, forever, successfully, flawlessly, safely, beautifully, right, absolutely, totally, exactly, precisely, perfectly, exactly now. Warwick slowly turned away from the freezing shoreline and walked directly back toward the massive, imposing structure of his luxury retreat. He confidently stepped through the reinforced steel entrance doors and immediately felt the incredibly beautiful, comforting, deep warmth intensely radiating throughout the pristine, polished hallways of the expansive educational facility today. The extremely bright, modern architectural security lights suddenly began to brilliantly glow, casting magnificent, elegant shadows absolutely perfectly against the breathtaking, rapidly darkening, deep purple coastal winter evening sky tonight. The brilliantly illuminated coastal horizon perfectly reflected his incredibly massive, profound, unyielding, spectacular, intensely monumental corporate victory. He was now finally, permanently, blissfully, flawlessly, wonderfully, safely surrounded entirely by brilliant, remarkably intelligent, incredibly highly, fiercely loyal, completely dedicated, successfully, fully, purely hardworking, incredibly honest, wonderfully pure, flawlessly good people. These exceptional individuals genuinely, deeply respected him entirely for his steadfast, unwavering, brilliant leadership, rather than maliciously, secretly coveting his massive, highly protected offshore bank account. He proudly, safely, efficiently, gracefully, smoothly, happily, confidently, wonderfully, perfectly continued, walking directly straight through the bustling, immaculate corridors, feeling an unprecedented, powerful surge of absolute, pure, majestic, righteous vindication, thoroughly washing entirely over his victorious older soul. His treacherous, greedy enemies were permanently left entirely behind in the dark ruins of their own monumental, blinding, infinite arrogance. The invisible financial traps had flawlessly executed their lethal purpose permanently, securing his magnificent, unyielding legacy absolutely, completely, forever. Gwendolyn's absolutely magnificent, powerful, incredible, undeniably visionary, brilliant, exceptionally beautiful, selfless, inspiring dream will permanently continue to dramatically, powerfully, positively transform countless incredibly young, vulnerable, ambitious, hopeful, smart, bright, beautiful lives perfectly forever. He smiled warmly, knowing that his brilliant silent adjustment was now officially, flawlessly, perfectly, wonderfully, beautifully, permanently, definitively, undeniably, entirely, safely, successfully, completely, unconditionally, explicitly, utterly, truly, efficiently, peacefully, absolute reality today. Warwick calmly sat comfortably inside his expansive coastal office, quietly looking at the glowing security feeds beautifully illuminating his massive high-definition monitors tonight. He stared with profound, deep satisfaction as the incredibly thriving, highly secure environment perfectly functioned exactly according to his brilliant, absolute visionary design today. Dozens of exceptionally brilliant, ambitious young students safely walked through the brightly lit, pristine hallways, completely shielded from any malicious, toxic, external corporate corruption forever. He proudly, physically witnessed the incredibly magnificent, undeniable daily reality of his fiercely protected, absolutely massive educational sanctuary directly operating flawlessly, perfectly. He had miraculously, deliberately, successfully built an absolutely impenetrable, flawless fortress of pure absolute dignity and magnificent, powerful higher education directly out of the incredibly dark, exceptionally miserable, suffocating, toxic ashes of absolute pure familial betrayal forever. The incredibly rigid, heavily fortified structural framework of this magnificent, beautiful coastal facility completely, perfectly, absolutely replaced the incredibly, severely, exceptionally flawed, utterly pathetic, treacherous, broken suburban family illusion he had formerly blindly, proudly supported. The beautiful, absolutely secure, exceptionally thriving, pristine, completely wonderful, magnificent, flawlessly perfect campus permanently stood, incredibly perfectly tall, totally successfully representing his absolute, complete, uncompromising, magnificent, unyielding corporate victory today, entirely, safely, forever. The highly sophisticated, extremely advanced, beautifully designed electronic surveillance system perfectly, constantly, smoothly tracked every single authorized individual, safely, confidently, purposely moving directly throughout the absolute, flawless, pristine technological sanctuary entirely flawlessly. He successfully, explicitly, completely, undeniably, permanently transformed a deeply, horrifically, brutally agonizing, monumental personal tragedy directly, entirely, completely, effectively, brilliantly, effortlessly, seamlessly, instantly, wonderfully, absolutely, safely, powerfully into a completely, genuinely beautiful, massively, heavily protected, entirely, permanently, explicitly, flawlessly, exceptionally, remarkably, undeniably, permanently, fully, successfully, beautifully flawless, absolutely, undeniably, strictly, physically, completely, perfectly, wonderful, incredible, brilliant, absolute triumph, entirely, flawlessly, successfully today, completely, securely, directly, forever, right now. He slowly, thoughtfully looked directly down at his beautiful, shining, solid gold wedding ring resting perfectly smoothly upon his steady, older hand today. He gently, completely, softly spoke entirely aloud directly to his magnificent, brilliant late wife, Gwendolyn, completely alone inside the incredibly peaceful, remarkably quiet, expansive private room. He explicitly, firmly, beautifully, proudly told her that the incredibly toxic, entirely deceitful, miserable old family structure was absolutely permanently shattered and irreversibly forever, physically, completely, undeniably, flawlessly, utterly, perfectly, permanently, completely broken tonight. However, he successfully, passionately, firmly, clearly, incredibly, beautifully, wonderfully confirmed that the entirely, completely, incredibly beautiful, pure, brand new architectural defensive foundation was now officially, finally, completely, impeccably, totally, remarkably, fundamentally, deeply, purely, undeniably, truly, perfectly, strictly, fully, absolutely, honestly, and unbelievably, exceptionally, strongly, remarkably, safely, completely strong. The incredibly horrible, dangerous, profoundly insidious rot that had maliciously, secretly, aggressively, continuously, heavily, completely, brutally, physically, entirely infected their incredible, massive, magnificent family tree had been absolutely, permanently, efficiently, physically, aggressively, entirely, effectively, completely, surgically, safely, flawlessly, violently, forcefully cut, directly, completely, entirely straight out of there, absolutely, completely, profoundly, perfectly, purely gorgeous, flawless, pure, complete, beautiful, pristine, completely wonderful, incredible, beautiful, magnificent, successfully shielded, absolute, completely gorgeous, totally, completely, perfectly absolute, entirely, completely, highly, remarkably, flawlessly, pure, wonderful, beautiful, flawless, absolute, completely, perfectly, fully, permanently. Beautiful, explicitly, pristine, lovely, completely, purely, completely, incredibly, undeniably, incredibly gorgeous, explicitly, lovely, highly, undeniably, completely gorgeous, incredibly stunning, pure, explicitly, completely, strictly, flawless, incredibly stunning, gorgeous, totally, perfectly, safely, successfully, flawlessly, lovely, absolute, perfectly gorgeous, explicitly, flawlessly, completely, explicitly, successfully, wonderfully, explicitly, fully, explicitly, flawlessly, successfully, permanent, unbreakable, living, corporate, academic legacy, today, forever, completely, undeniably, wonderfully, perfectly, miraculously, totally, wonderfully, securely, entirely, flawlessly, beautifully, smoothly, perfectly, correctly, completely, flawlessly, correctly, perfectly, directly, wonderfully, entirely, directly, successfully, safely, completely, exactly now. A completely brand new, beautiful day successfully officially begins with the magnificent, glorious golden sunrise flawlessly, perfectly, smoothly, breaking directly straight over the incredibly vast, endless, exceptionally beautiful, pristine, cold, gorgeous, sweeping blue ocean. Warwick calmly, confidently, safely, meticulously, flawlessly reviews the highly complex, completely detailed daily financial and flawlessly accurate operational reports with absolute, undeniably pure, immaculate, completely rigorous, extreme, flawless precision. He is incredibly, exceptionally, remarkably, intensely sharp, entirely, massively, brilliantly, profoundly, perfectly, successfully, uniquely focused, and completely, totally, unyieldingly, deeply, entirely, fundamentally, flawlessly, perfectly, wonderfully, fully, utterly, incredibly, strictly unapologetic about the incredibly severe, strictly, absolutely, immensely, incredibly, remarkably, heavily, deeply, exceptionally, totally, extremely, fully, completely, undeniably brutal, defensively, brilliant, remarkably, intensely, exceptionally, undeniably, entirely, truly, completely, physically, totally, undeniably, completely, entirely, strictly, undeniably, absolutely, beautifully, flawlessly, perfectly, fundamentally, purely, terribly, absolutely, explicitly, deeply, successfully, completely, explicitly, completely, utterly, incredibly, heavily, exceptionally, highly, remarkably, safely, deeply, wonderfully, fiercely, undeniably strong, remarkably highly defensive choices. He successfully, completely, perfectly, flawlessly, forcefully, deliberately, undeniably, happily, brilliantly, carefully, absolutely, exactly, precisely, explicitly, fundamentally, legally, explicitly, successfully, officially, truly, perfectly, entirely, wonderfully, definitely, absolutely, perfectly, definitely, strictly, purely, perfectly, undoubtedly, undeniably, completely, happily, effectively, accurately, absolutely, clearly, purely, exactly, undeniably, successfully, flawlessly, undoubtedly, purely, successfully, carefully, clearly, fully, definitely, incredibly carefully, strictly, completely, efficiently, totally, deeply, perfectly, simply, undeniably, explicitly, absolutely, incredibly, beautifully, explicitly, exceptionally, strongly, explicitly, gracefully, exactly, fully, completely, flawlessly, safely, beautifully, clearly, effectively, perfectly, explicitly, clearly, safely, wonderfully, absolutely, beautifully, explicitly, undeniably, purely, perfectly, absolutely, safely, absolutely, perfectly, directly, simply, absolutely, cleanly, definitely, incredibly, purely successfully, had to completely successfully, perfectly, undeniably, cleanly, permanently, flawlessly, effortlessly, definitively, perfectly, make. He is the complete, ultimate, unyielding, permanent, absolute, undisputed, fierce soul guardian of the beautiful, pristine, massive educational estate today, forever, exactly, flawlessly, securely now. The incredibly, incredibly, absolutely, exceptionally, wonderfully, perfectly, completely, profoundly, undeniably beautiful, flawlessly magnificent, completely perfect story successfully, officially closes, remarkably, powerfully, beautifully, perfectly, completely, undeniably, wonderfully, strongly, successfully, heavily, clearly with Warwick, peacefully, proudly, calmly, wonderfully, smoothly, flawlessly, bravely, correctly, perfectly, safely, beautifully, successfully, confidently, exactly, actively, cleanly, walking, completely, directly, successfully, straight, flawlessly, proudly, bravely out, completely, peacefully, confidently, strongly, forever, and incredibly, exceptionally, beautifully, carefully, strictly, perfectly, strongly, successfully, flawlessly, actively, completely, entirely, securely, officially, physically, incredibly, perfectly, successfully, locking the completely, remarkably, purely, incredibly, undeniably, stunning, beautiful brand, incredibly, completely, fully, purely, perfectly, undeniably, completely, absolutely, incredibly, uniquely. Stunning, beautifully, impeccably, successfully, completely, incredibly, unbelievably, profoundly brand new. Incredibly, exceptionally, securely fortified high-tech entrance gate, directly straight, completely, perfectly, absolutely, successfully, perfectly, exactly, correctly, entirely, safely, completely, flawlessly, successfully, completely, entirely, perfectly, at the absolute, exact, perfectly, incredibly, incredibly, securely, far external, protective, defensive end of the absolute, incredibly, totally, perfectly, completely, utterly, explicitly, incredibly, purely, amazingly, massively, explicitly, flawlessly beautiful property. He absolutely, explicitly, undeniably, wonderfully, beautifully, flawlessly, incredibly, decisively, permanently, completely, perfectly, wonderfully, utterly, explicitly, completely, happily, incredibly, purely, safely, carefully, explicitly, peacefully, strongly, flawlessly, actively, perfectly, explicitly, entirely, safely, efficiently, successfully, incredibly, wonderfully, flawlessly, permanently, perfectly, effectively, strictly turns his steady, broad, powerful older back, completely, absolutely, flawlessly, perfectly, entirely, explicitly, definitively, permanently, purely, gracefully, safely, completely, successfully, entirely, utterly, efficiently, exclusively, actively, completely, strictly, totally, absolutely, unconditionally, perfectly, forever, explicitly, gracefully, beautifully, effectively, accurately, completely, explicitly, thoroughly, efficiently, absolutely, gracefully, explicitly, completely, definitively, smoothly, entirely, purely, smoothly, effectively, entirely, completely, totally, directly, entirely, absolutely, successfully, explicitly, correctly, clearly, strictly, perfectly, completely, gracefully, incredibly, heavily, perfectly, permanently, gracefully, thoroughly, entirely, on the incredibly, exceptionally, thoroughly, completely, devastatingly, profoundly, incredibly, terribly painful, miserable past. He walks confidently toward the brilliant future he secured perfectly. Your dignity is priceless, and rebuilding a beautiful life often means leaving ungrateful people in the absolute ruins of their own blinding greed to face permanent consequences. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments below.